What if the greatest dangers in our world don't come from monsters, but from ordinary people refusing to think for themselves? That was the question Hannah Arendt placed before the world in 1963, when she published her account of Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat responsible for coordinating the logistics of mass deportations to concentration camps, sat in a glass booth as survivors testified about trains that carried their families to death. The expectation was clear. Here was a monster, a sadist, a devil in human skin. But to Arendt's astonishment, what she saw was something more chilling and more dangerous. A man who appeared ordinary, even dull. He spoke in cliches. He justified himself with phrases borrowed from office memos. He insisted he had simply followed orders. Arendt called this the banality of evil. Not banal because the crimes were small, they were vast and unthinkable, but banal because the man behind them seemed unthinking. He was not consumed by demonic passion, nor even by personal hatred. He was consumed by thoughtlessness, a refusal to examine the meaning of what he was doing. In her telling, the Holocaust was not made possible by millions of fanatics alone, but by countless clerks, police officers, and train conductors who surrendered their judgment to routines and commands. The scandal of her claim was immediate and fierce. Survivors accused her of excusing Eichmann. Intellectuals accused her of cold detachment. Friends who had shared her exile from Nazi Germany cut ties. What most enraged her critics was not simply her description of Eichmann, but the terrifying mirror it held up to society. If evil can emerge from mediocrity, then no one is safely outside its reach. But to understand how Arendt arrived at this unsettling insight, we must go back before the Jerusalem courtroom, before the war, before she became a refugee. We must trace the formation of a mind that refused to accept comforting explanations. We must see how a young Jewish girl from Königsberg became the thinker who told the world, evil wears an ordinary face. Königsberg was a city with ghosts. Once the proud home of Immanuel Kant, whose philosophy promised that reason could anchor human morality, by the early 1900s it was already showing signs of fracture. Nationalism simmered. Anti-Jewish prejudice lingered beneath the polished surface of bourgeois society. Into this world, on October 14, 1906, Hannah Arendt was born, the only child of Paul and Martha Arendt. Her parents were assimilated Jews, secular and politically engaged, members of the Social Democratic Party. They believed in progress and reason, in a Germany that could embrace justice and equality. Her father, Paul, was a mechanical engineer, but illness shadowed his life. He suffered from syphilis, contracted before marriage, which would eventually kill him when Hannah was only 7. His illness meant that her childhood was marked not only by the shadow of social prejudice, but by the intimate reality of suffering at home. Watching her father's decline, she learned early that life did not obey the rational promises of politics or philosophy. There were forces, disease, prejudice, cruelty that disregarded ideals. Her mother, Martha, was fiercely protective and intellectually demanding. She encouraged Hannah's precocity, allowing her to read freely from their library. From her, Arendt inherited both a skeptical independence and a sense of political seriousness. Martha would later risk her life smuggling messages for socialist causes, and she raised Hannah to believe that one must never turn away from public responsibility. In this household, Hannah learned to ask questions more quickly than most children learned to obey rules. By adolescence, she was known for her sharpness, her refusal to accept answers that rang hollow. Later, she would recall how, even as a girl, she despised empty phrases. Those little turns of speech that people used to cover uncomfortable truths. It was a seed of her later philosophy. Evil begins in cliché, in words spoken without thinking. She grew up surrounded by books, ideas, and debate. When her family moved to Königsberg proper after her father's death, she became an outstanding student. Teachers noted her brilliance, but also her defiance. She was not content to memorize. She wanted to probe the why, the how, the consequence. That insistence on thought, on going beneath the surface, would mark her entire intellectual journey. But a question lingers. Why did this child, out of all the children growing up amid prejudice and war in Germany, become the one who insisted that thoughtlessness was the root of evil? What made her different? Was it simply her brilliance? Or was it the specific pain of watching her father die, of seeing adults hide behind platitudes while illness consumed him? Did she learn then that words can protect or betray truth? She would one day write that philosophy begins not with answers, but with wonder. Yet in her life, wonder was never innocent. It was sharpened by suspicion, by the knowledge that behind society's noble words lay cruelty and contradiction. The world into which she was born was collapsing. The First World War broke out when she was 8 years old. Her mother, like so many in Germany, supported the war at first, but Hannah remembered hunger, scarcity, and the sound of men returning broken. She saw the promises of civilization shatter under artillery fire. The Enlightenment dream of progress, of rational control, seemed fragile. And yet, she would not let go of the possibility of meaning. If anything, the destruction made the question sharper. How can humans create systems that justify slaughter? This question would never leave her. Her adolescence was marked by both intellectual promise and personal turmoil. By 16, she was devouring philosophy, theology, literature. She read Kant, Kierkegaard, and German poetry. She fell into disputes with teachers who accused her of arrogance. Some classmates thought her aloof. But she was already, even then, forming the habit that would define her life, to think independently, even if it meant standing alone. Years later, critics would accuse her of arrogance when she wrote about Eichmann. They would say she lacked sympathy. But the root of her stance lay here, in the adolescent conviction that truth mattered more than comfort. She would not say what people wanted to hear. She would say what she believed was true. It is easy, in hindsight, to see her childhood as preparation for her role in history. Yet, we must be careful. Hannah Arendt was not born a prophet. She was a girl who loved books, who mourned her father, who tested her mother's patience with relentless questions. She laughed, she wept, she quarreled. The philosopher was not separate from the child. The child was the seed. Still, the question lingers, and it will follow us through her entire story. If ordinary people can become complicit in horror by refusing to think, then what does it mean to truly think? What does it demand of us? The story of Hannah Arendt begins here. Not with a courtroom in Jerusalem, not with scandal, but with a child in Königsberg who refused to be satisfied with borrowed words. And yet, her life was about to collide with forces that would test her conviction. Germany was changing. Nationalism was hardening into something darker. By the time Hannah was a teenager, the seeds of Nazism were already being planted. Her refusal to accept cliché would soon become not just a quirk of personality, but a matter of survival. The Germany of Hannah Arendt's youth was restless, wounded, and searching for identity. The First World War had not only killed millions, but also shattered the nation's sense of stability. By the time Hannah was in her teenage years, the Weimar Republic was struggling to govern a society humiliated by defeat, burdened by reparations, and destabilized by hyperinflation. And, in the streets of Königsberg and Berlin, she would have seen soldiers begging, veterans with missing limbs, and angry crowds demanding someone to blame. For many, the temptation was simple: find scapegoats. Jews became easy targets. Though the Arendt family was secular, their Jewishness marked them in ways that Hannah could never escape. The irony was bitter. Her family believed in reason, progress, and belonging to German culture. Yet they were reminded, again and again, that no matter their loyalty, they were outsiders. This tension, between identity chosen and identity imposed, would become one of the central themes of her philosophy. Hannah's response to this world was not despair, but intensity. She read voraciously. She debated teachers. She found herself drawn toward philosophy, theology, and poetry as if they were lifelines in a collapsing society. She once told friends she had read the New Testament at 16, not as religious doctrine, but as a text to be examined with the same seriousness as Plato or Goethe. What mattered was not the authority of the words, but what they revealed when truly thought through. At school, she clashed with teachers who accused her of insolence. When told she was disruptive, she retorted that asking questions was not disruption, but thinking. This refusal to submit to authority, This insistence that thought was a personal responsibility would become the mark of her life. For most students, school was preparation for obedience. For Hannah, it was training for defiance. But adolescence also brought isolation. Brilliant and argumentative, she often seemed apart from her peers. Friends recalled her as magnetic but intimidating. She was quick to laugh, but quicker to challenge. Those who knew her sensed a restlessness, as if she already understood that the ordinary expectations of marriage and conformity would never contain her. By 17, she was consumed by philosophy. And in 1924, when she turned 18, she left Königsberg for Marburg University. Her first escape from the provincial city and the beginning of an education that would shape her forever. Marburg was a small, conservative town, yet it hosted one of the most brilliant philosophers of the 20th century, Martin Heidegger. Hannah arrived eager, intense, determined to study. She could not have known that she was about to encounter not only a mentor, but a relationship that would entangle her life in contradictions that still provoke debate today. Heidegger was already famous, though not yet the towering figure he would become with the publication of Being and Time in 1927. He was charismatic in the classroom, electrifying students with lectures that demanded philosophy be lived, not just studied. He asked questions that struck at the core of existence. What does it mean to be? How does time shape our understanding of ourselves? To his students, he seemed less a lecturer than a prophet. For Hannah, who had grown up despising cliches and seeking depth, Heidegger's thought was intoxicating. His philosophy demanded an authenticity she had always pursued. And soon, it was not only his ideas, but the man himself who captivated her. Despite being married with children, Heidegger began a secret affair with the 18-year-old student. This relationship would become one of the most controversial aspects of Arendt's biography. Critics have condemned it as naive, reckless, even shameful, especially given Heidegger's later support for Nazism. Defenders argue that for Hannah, the relationship was formative, even essential, in shaping her sense of the intimacy between life and thought. Whatever judgment one passes, one fact is clear. Her bond with Heidegger changed the trajectory of her life. But here again, we see the paradox of Hannah Arendt. She, who despised thoughtlessness, fell into a relationship that forced her into secrecy and compromise. She, who demanded authenticity, entered an entanglement that would haunt her. Perhaps this was not a contradiction, but a human truth. She never denied that philosophy does not exempt us from weakness, and that even the most rigorous thinker is vulnerable to the messiness of love. Meanwhile, outside the walls of Marburg, Germany was changing. The Weimar Republic struggled against extremist forces. Inflation devastated the economy. Political violence erupted between communists and nationalists. The Nazis, still a small fringe party, were beginning to rise, their rallies feeding on resentment and humiliation. Arendt was immersed in Heidegger's world of being, time, and authenticity, but the external world was preparing lessons harsher than any lecture hall could provide. Soon, she would have to decide whether philosophy could remain an ivory tower pursuit, or whether it demanded confrontation with politics in its most brutal form. At Marburg, Hannah found not only intellectual passion, but also an identity as a philosopher. For the first time, she saw herself as part of a lineage of thought that stretched back to Kant and Plato. Yet she was already carving her own path. She rejected the idea of philosophy as abstract system building. For her, thought was tied to life. To think was to act, not in slogans or obedience, but in judgment, in the refusal to let someone else do your thinking for you. This conviction would grow sharper as she moved on from Marburg to Freiburg, where she studied briefly with Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, and then to Heidelberg, where she completed her dissertation under Karl Jaspers. Each mentor shaped her differently, Heidegger with his intensity, Husserl with his rigor, Jaspers with his humanity. But always, Hannah remained herself, independent, questioning, unwilling to submit. And yet, one must ask, how does a young Jewish woman, brilliant and defiant, find her place in a Germany where anti-Semitism was tightening its grip? What did it mean to seek truth in a country where lies were gaining power? This is the tension we carry forward. Hannah Arendt was becoming a philosopher, yes, but she was also becoming a target, though she did not yet know it. Her years of study would prepare her mind, but the storm gathering outside would test her very survival. The young woman in the lecture halls of Marburg could not yet imagine the refugee she would become, fleeing Germany with nothing but a suitcase. But already, the seeds were planted. Philosophy, for Hannah, was not a luxury. It was preparation for the most dangerous century in human history. When Hannah Arendt left Marburg and her clandestine affair with Martin Heidegger behind, she carried both the fire of his philosophy and the burden of its secrecy. Yet she did not remain trapped in his orbit. She moved first to Freiburg, where she briefly studied with Edmund Husserl, and then to Heidelberg, where she encountered a teacher who would change her life in a very different way. Karl Jaspers. Jaspers was older, humane, and deeply ethical. Where Heidegger was enigmatic, sometimes manipulative, Jaspers was transparent. Where Heidegger often cloaked his thought in cryptic language, Jaspers insisted on clarity. And where Heidegger seemed to regard philosophy as a solitary heroic act, Jaspers rooted it in communication and friendship. For Hannah, who craved intellectual intensity but also human connection, Jaspers became not only a mentor but a lifelong friend. Under Jaspers, she completed her dissertation in 1929. Its subject was a figure who fascinated her, St. Augustine. She titled it Love and St. Augustine. On the surface, it was a study in Christian theology, but beneath it lay Arendt's early obsession with human connection, with what it means to live in relation to others. Augustine's insistence that love is the force binding human beings together resonated with her own refusal to accept abstract philosophy divorced from the human world. But even as she immersed herself in ancient texts, the Germany outside her study rooms was changing. The Wall Street crash of 1929 plunged the global economy into crisis. In Germany, unemployment soared. The Weimar Republic staggered, extremist parties flourished, and the Nazis began to look less like a fringe and more like a rising force. Anti-Jewish rhetoric intensified. Arendt, still in her 20s, was both a young scholar and a Jewish woman living in a society where hatred was becoming normalized. For her, philosophy could never remain only a private pursuit. Already she felt the pull toward politics, though she did not yet know how urgently it would claim her. During these years, she also experienced a series of personal transformations. She ended her romantic relationship with Heidegger, though the two would remain bound by correspondence and later by controversy. She began to define herself more clearly as independent, not just intellectually, but emotionally. She forged close ties with Jewish intellectual circles, reading Hebrew literature and engaging with questions of identity. And she began to notice something troubling: the reluctance of many assimilated Jews to acknowledge the danger rising around them. This was the paradox she would later describe with such clarity, that many educated Jews in Germany clung to culture, to tradition, to the belief that their belonging was secure, while the world around them was preparing to strip that belonging away. Hannah saw in this not cowardice but a tragic form of thoughtlessness, the very same refusal to see reality that would one day horrify her at Eichmann's trial. By 1930, Hannah was poised for a brilliant academic career. She was publishing, studying, and working with respected mentors. But history was closing in. The Nazis gained seats in parliament. The violence of their rallies spilled into the streets. For Hannah, the question sharpened: could one remain in Germany, studying Augustine, while the ground beneath was shifting so violently? In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. For many, it still seemed inconceivable that he would dismantle the Republic. For Arendt, the danger was unmistakable. That same year, she was arrested by the Gestapo for her work collecting anti-Nazi materials. It was her first brush with the machinery of terror. Though released after 8 days, she understood the meaning. Germany was no longer safe. It is easy to imagine another Hannah Arendt, one who stayed in academia, who built a quiet career teaching philosophy. But that possibility ended in 1933. From then on, she was a political exile, a refugee, a thinker forged in displacement. She fled first to Paris. There, among other émigrés, she began a new phase of life. She worked with Jewish refugee organizations, helping resettle young people in Palestine. She moved from philosophy as an academic pursuit to philosophy as lived action. Later, she would describe this as the moment she stopped being a philosopher and became instead a political thinker. But Paris was not only struggle, it was also the city where she met Heinrich Blücher, the man who would become her husband and lifelong companion. A German communist, Blücher was unorthodox, skeptical, passionate, and unlike anyone she had known. With him, Hannah found something she had not found with Heidegger, a partner who challenged her without overshadowing her. Their bond was tempestuous but enduring, and it gave her stability through the storms to come. Yet exile was never simple. The 1930s in Paris were marked by tension, poverty, and uncertainty. Refugees were caught in limbo, unwanted by some, distrusted by others. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Hannah was interned as an enemy alien in Gurs, a camp for German refugees. She escaped, miraculously, before the camp was handed over to the Nazis. By 1941, she and Blücher managed to secure passage to America, carrying little more than their determination to survive. The young woman who had once been a brilliant student in Königsberg and Marburg was now a stateless refugee in New York. She had lost her homeland, her academic career, her secure identity, but she had not lost her mind, nor her conviction that thinking mattered more than ever. And here's where the story bends again. For Arendt, exile was not just a tragedy. It was also a liberation. Stripped of national belonging, she was forced to confront what it means to live without roots. Later, she would write that refugees are the vanguard of history, forced to see truths that stable citizens ignore. In her own life, this meant that displacement became a lens through which she saw the modern world, not as a secure place of progress, but as a fragile, contingent stage where human beings could be stripped of dignity at any moment. From Heidegger to Jaspers, from Augustine to exile, Arendt's intellectual awakening was never purely abstract. It was entangled with her biography at every step. Philosophy, for her, was not escape from life, but confrontation with its hardest realities. And so, the question that began our journey, what if the greatest dangers come from ordinary people refusing to think, was already being tested in her 20s. She saw ordinary Germans surrender to nationalism. She saw Jewish friends cling to illusions. She saw bureaucrats turn neighbors into statistics. She understood that thoughtlessness was not rare, it was common, and she vowed that her life's work would be to resist it. But survival in America was no easy thing. She arrived with little English, no job, and a fractured identity. What does one do when the country that shaped you has declared you an enemy? Who are you when you belong nowhere? For Hannah Arendt, this was not only a personal crisis, it was a philosophical one. And it was in New York, among refugees, poets, and exiles, that she would begin to form the ideas that would one day shock the world. New York in 1941 was a city of noise, light, and anonymity. For Hannah Arendt, stepping off the ship after fleeing Vichy France, it was both salvation and disorientation. She had lost almost everything familiar, her homeland, her language, her professional standing. Yet she was alive, and in America she could begin again. But beginning again was not simple. She spoke little English, had no secure employment, and carried the trauma of displacement. For the first months, she survived through odd jobs, translating, reviewing manuscripts, helping refugee organizations. Friends recalled her humor in the face of poverty, her insistence that despair was useless. But beneath the resilience lay a deeper determination to rebuild not only a life, but a voice. Arendt quickly immersed herself in the émigré community of New York. Cafe tables became her classroom, circles of displaced Europeans, her intellectual home. She joined forces with writers, poets, and scholars who, like her, carried the scar of exile. Together they formed a diaspora of thought, rootless yet fertile. Among them was Heinrich Blücher, her husband, whose companionship gave her strength. Their marriage was unconventional, often stormy, but bound by a shared refusal to accept conformity. In America, Hannah began to write in German, then in English. Her first major project was The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951. It was an ambitious attempt to understand the unprecedented, the rise of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. Arendt argued that totalitarianism was not merely another form of tyranny, but a new kind of domination, one that sought to destroy individuality itself. Her central claim was startling. Totalitarianism, she wrote, begins by isolating individuals, stripping away traditional bonds of family, class, religion, and nation, leaving people atomized and lonely. In this loneliness, ideology takes root. Mass movements feed not on conviction, but on emptiness. And once mobilized, these movements demand absolute conformity, transforming human beings into mere functions of the machine. For readers in post-war America, this analysis was electrifying. Here was an exile, a Jewish woman, daring to tell the Western world that Nazism was not an aberration confined to Germany, but a warning about what modern society could become. The book established Arendt as a thinker of global stature, but it also set her apart. She refused the comfort of ideological camps. Anti-communists accused her of excusing the left. Leftists accused her of serving the Cold War agenda. Arendt belonged to neither side. She belonged to thought itself. Meanwhile, her life in America was slowly stabilizing. She taught at universities, lectured widely, and became a fixture of intellectual circles. She wrote essays for journals, engaged in debates, and cultivated friendships with poets like W. H. Auden and writers like Mary McCarthy. To many, she seemed both formidable and intimate. Formidable in her uncompromising clarity, intimate in her laughter, her storytelling, her accent that carried the weight of exile. But exile never left her. She remained stateless until 1951, when she became an American citizen. For nearly 2 decades, she had lived without nationality, dependent on temporary permits and bureaucratic mercy. This experience shaped her most haunting concept, the right to have rights. For Arendt, human rights were meaningless unless guaranteed by political community. A stateless person, stripped of citizenship, was reduced to bare life, alive, but unprotected, existing outside the law. This insight would echo through her later works, especially when she wrote about refugees and pariahs. She understood, not abstractly but personally, that belonging is not sentimental. It is political. Without a state, one is vulnerable to erasure. And yet, in that vulnerability, she also saw a strange kind of clarity. The stateless reveal the fragility of all human arrangements. During these years, Arendt's style as a thinker took its mature form. She was never a system builder like Hegel, nor a metaphysician like Heidegger. Instead, she wrote as a storyteller, a witness, a political theorist who preferred narrative and historical detail to abstraction. She once said she did not write philosophy but political theory, because philosophy seeks eternal truths while she was concerned with the contingencies of the human world. But in truth, her work was a fusion, philosophy brought to the marketplace, metaphysics anchored in history. Her students found her both intimidating and inspiring. She lectured in heavily accented English, sometimes with unexpected humor, sometimes with sudden passion. She did not demand agreement, she demanded thinking. One student later recalled, she did not want disciples, she wanted resistance. She wanted us to argue, because to her, thought was alive only in dialogue. Yet for all her rising influence, Hannah Arendt remained marked by contradiction. She had fled Europe, yet her most important works were about Europe. She lived in America, but she never fully became American in spirit. She cherished friendship, yet often provoked conflict with friends through her uncompromising stances. She seemed at once rooted and rootless, intimate and distant, warm and severe. These contradictions were not flaws to be ironed out, they were the very fabric of her life. She lived what she believed, that human beings are plural, that identity cannot be reduced to a single essence, that thinking itself is a refusal of simplification. But even as the origins of totalitarianism brought her acclaim, it also set her on a path toward greater controversy. For at its heart, the book raised an unanswerable question. If totalitarianism could emerge in Germany and Russia, could it also emerge elsewhere? Could it arise in modern democracies, if loneliness and thoughtlessness spread unchecked? This question was not academic. In the 1950s, America was gripped by McCarthyism, a paranoid hunt for communists that destroyed careers and silenced dissent. Arendt, who had seen the machinery of persecution before, recognized the danger. Though she did not equate McCarthyism with totalitarianism, she warned of its corrosive effects on public trust and political freedom. Once again, she refused to comfort. Once again, she was accused of exaggeration. But for her, vigilance was not paranoia. It was responsibility. And then came the event that would make her most famous and most infamous, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961. The young girl from Königsberg, the refugee in New York, the thinker who wrote about pariahs, was now confronted with the living embodiment of her question: what does it mean when evil wears an ordinary face? The journey to Jerusalem would not only test her philosophy but fracture her friendships, ignite scandal, and cement her legacy. But before that, we must pause in this American interlude. For it was here, in exile, in poverty, in recovery, that Arendt forged the intellectual steel she would bring to the courtroom. The woman who once studied Augustine in Heidelberg had become the thinker who insisted that the world must never again accept the comforting illusion that evil belongs only to monsters. In 1961, Hannah Arendt boarded a plane to Jerusalem. She was 54 years old, a naturalized American citizen, a respected writer, and a thinker with the authority of exile behind her. But she was also carrying an old wound, the wound of being a German Jew who had fled her homeland, who had seen friends murdered, and who had lived through statelessness. Now she was traveling not as a victim, but as an observer, a reporter for The New Yorker, to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann. The world expected a spectacle. Eichmann had been captured in Argentina by Israeli agents and smuggled to Jerusalem to stand trial for crimes against humanity. Survivors, politicians, and journalists converged on the courtroom. The proceedings were broadcast to the world. For many, Eichmann represented the embodiment of Nazi evil, the villain who had orchestrated the transport of millions to death camps. Arendt, however, was not content to see what others saw. Sitting in the courtroom, watching the man in the glass booth, she noticed something dissonant. Eichmann did not resemble a monster. He looked ordinary, balding, stiff, bureaucratic. He spoke in cliches, rattling off official phrases, mouthing the justifications of a functionary. He was not Iago and not Macbeth, she later wrote. Except for his extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. Arendt dared to describe Eichmann not as a demonic genius of evil, but as something more terrifying, an unthinking bureaucrat. She coined the phrase that would become her most famous and most misunderstood legacy, the banality of evil. Evil, she suggested, need not come dressed in passion or ideology. It could come dressed in the ordinary. It could be the man who insists he was just following orders, the clerk who stamps the papers, the conductor who closes the train doors. To Arendt, the danger of Eichmann lay precisely in his mediocrity. He was not a fanatic. He was not insane. He was something more disturbing, someone who refused to think. Thinking, for Arendt, meant the inner dialogue we conduct with ourselves. The capacity to stop, to ask, what am I doing? Can I live with myself if I do this? Eichmann, she argued, had abdicated that responsibility. He had surrendered judgment to orders, to slogans, to routine. The reaction was explosive. When her reports appeared in The New Yorker in 1963, and later as Eichmann in Jerusalem, she was denounced by survivors, intellectuals, and even friends. The Jewish establishment accused her of minimizing Eichmann's guilt. Others accused her of blaming victims, because she had observed that some Jewish councils under Nazi rule had been coerced into facilitating deportations. Her old friend Gershom Scholem accused her of lacking love of the Jewish people. Arendt replied with characteristic defiance, I have never in my life loved any people or collective. I indeed love only my friends. To her, loyalty was not owed to abstractions, but to individuals. And truth was not to be sacrificed for comfort, no matter the cost. The cost was immense. She was ostracized by many in Jewish and academic circles. Friends cut ties, invitations dried up. For years, her name was synonymous with betrayal, and yet she refused to retract a word. She insisted that her task was not to soothe, but to think. What is striking, reading her account today, is not coldness but urgency. Arendt was not excusing Eichmann, she called for his execution as just punishment. What she was doing was warning. If evil can be committed by ordinary men who refuse to think, then it is not safely contained in the past. It is a permanent risk. It could happen again, anywhere, whenever people surrender judgment. This is why the trial mattered to her. It was not only about one man's guilt, but about the human condition. How easily do we abdicate responsibility? How quickly do we hide behind the shield of orders, institutions, or cliches? These were not historical questions, they were existential ones. The courtroom in Jerusalem became, for Arendt, a mirror. What she saw was not only Eichmann, but the fragility of thought itself. Civilization depends not on obedience, but on conscience. The moment we stop thinking for ourselves, we become capable of anything. Her critics demanded outrage, condemnation, hatred. Arendt gave them something colder and more difficult, analysis. She asked them to look into the face of evil and recognize not the devil, but the neighbor. It is no wonder this provoked fury. To recognize Eichmann's ordinariness was to admit that evil is not alien, but human, not exceptional, but possible in all of us. It robbed people of the comforting illusion that villains are easily recognized. But Arendt never sought comfort. She sought truth, however unbearable. And so the phrase, banality of evil, entered the world to be debated, misused, simplified, and misunderstood ever since. In truth, she never meant banal in the sense of trivial. She meant banal in the sense of unthinking. Evil that is terrifying because it is not even deeply motivated. It is the emptiness that frightens. The fallout from Eichmann in Jerusalem nearly destroyed her reputation. But it also ensured her legacy. For while her critics raged, her readers could not forget the question she had raised. If Eichmann was ordinary, then what protects us from becoming him? In the years that followed, Arendt would continue to explore this question, turning her attention to the nature of politics, freedom, and the act of thinking itself. But the scandal of Eichmann marked a turning point. She was no longer just an exile thinker. She was a public figure, admired and reviled, quoted and condemned. And yet, if we step back, we see continuity. From the girl in Königsberg who despised cliches, to the student who argued with teachers, to the refugee who refused silence, Arendt's life had always been a refusal to accept unthinking words. The courtroom in Jerusalem was simply the most public stage for that refusal. The question now was whether she could withstand the isolation it brought. Once again, Hannah Arendt found herself alone, misunderstood, attacked, but unbowed. And beneath the controversy lay a deeper mystery, still unanswered. If the banality of evil is real, what can possibly stand against it? To understand Hannah Arendt's fearless independence, the voice that would one day confront totalitarianism, scandalize friends, and insist that truth could not be sacrificed for loyalty, we must return to her beginnings. Before Jerusalem, before New York, before Paris and exile, there was Königsberg, a city of cobbled streets, shifting identities, and ghosts of philosophy past. Königsberg was once the home of Immanuel Kant, whose shadow lingered over the city's intellectual atmosphere. To grow up, there was to grow up in the presence of reason, of enlightenment promises, and of the unspoken question, could rational morality hold against the tides of history? For Hannah, born in 1906, that question would be lived long before she ever studied Kant's works. Her parents, Paul and Martha Arendt, were assimilated Jews who belonged to the Social Democratic Party. They were secular, progressive, hopeful that Germany could be a homeland where Jews and non-Jews lived together. Paul was an engineer, technically skilled, pragmatic, and warm-hearted. Martha was sharp, politically aware, protective, and demanding. Together, they embodied a confidence in progress that Hannah would later see betrayed by history. But the optimism of her household was overshadowed by illness. Paul Arendt suffered from syphilis, contracted before marriage, a disease that at the time carried not only medical consequences but stigma. As his health declined, Hannah's childhood was marked by watching him weaken and eventually die when she was just 7. The experience of loss, of watching adults falter, left an indelible mark. She learned early that security was fragile, that ideals and promises could not shield one from the brute realities of the body. Her mother Martha, left widowed, became Hannah's fiercest guide. She instilled discipline, but also resistance. When teachers disciplined Hannah unfairly, Martha encouraged her to challenge them. When authority demanded blind obedience, Martha told her daughter to think for herself. Hannah later recalled that her mother insisted she must never tolerate injustice, even if it meant defiance. This maternal lesson would reverberate through her life. It was not abstract philosophy, it was lived experience. To be Aaron's daughter was to be raised in skepticism, independence, and courage. At school, Hannah quickly distinguished herself as precocious and difficult. She memorized quickly, but she was not content with answers given. Teachers complained of her interruptions, her argumentative tone. She challenged religious instruction, questioned patriotic platitudes, resisted conformity. Already, the young girl displayed the trait that would scandalize the world decades later, an unwillingness to say what others expected her to say. But childhood was not only resistance. Hannah devoured books. She read Goethe, Schiller, and Homer. She turned to poetry as a refuge, carrying verses with her into adulthood. She later said that poetry saved her. When philosophy was overwhelmed by terror, poetry kept meaning alive. In childhood, this meant that while she argued with teachers, she also fell silent with books, absorbing rhythms of language that shaped her later prose. The world around her was unsettled. Hannah was 8 when the First World War began. She remembered hunger, rationing, shortages, and the collapse of stability. The optimism of her parents' generation was shattered by trenches, artillery, and defeat. Königsberg, once a city of confident bourgeois order, became a place of wounded pride and restless anger. The post-war years were no gentler. Inflation devoured savings, veterans returned bitter. Political extremism grew. For Jews, assimilation became more fragile. On the one hand, many Jews were prominent in intellectual and professional life. On the other, they became targets for resentment. Hannah grew up in this tension: belonging and exclusion, integration and suspicion. She absorbed what it meant to live on the edge of acceptance, always aware that her identity could be turned against her. And yet, even as a child, she refused to be defined by it. Friends recalled her confidence, even arrogance. She knew she was brilliant and did not hide it. She challenged boys as easily as teachers. She demanded seriousness in conversation. Childhood, for her, was not innocence but apprenticeship for a life of thought. But there was another side. Her father's death left her with vulnerability, a recognition that even the strongest adults could fall. Beneath the sharpness was grief. Beneath the defiance was loss. She carried both, the insistence on truth and the knowledge of fragility. By adolescence, Hannah was consumed by philosophy. She read Kant, Kierkegaard, and theology before most of her classmates had mastered basic texts. She wrestled with the meaning of existence, faith, and freedom. She was already, in her teens, preparing the questions that would define her life. But we must not imagine her as a solemn prodigy only. She was lively, social, even mischievous. She sang, she laughed, she played. What made her different was not lack of vitality, but the refusal to separate thought from life. For Hannah, thinking was not abstract but lived. It was how one breathed in a world that often demanded silence. Her teenage years also revealed the contradictions she would never resolve. She longed for belonging, but refused conformity. She was intensely loyal to friends, but often alienated them with her sharpness. She craved intellectual intimacy, but resisted authority. These tensions would shape her relationships for decades, from Heidegger to McCarthy, from Jaspers to Skolem. It is tempting to see destiny in her childhood: the brilliant girl, the resistant student, the daughter who refused obedience. But Arendt resisted such narratives. She insisted that biography does not determine philosophy, and yet it is impossible to miss the continuity. The child who despised clichés became the woman who unmasked Eichmann's clichés as dangerous. The daughter taught to resist injustice became the thinker who confronted totalitarianism. By the time she finished secondary school, her path was clear. She would study philosophy, she would not be confined by convention, she would leave Königsberg for the universities that promised depth and challenge. And so, in 1924, at 18, Hannah Arendt left for Marburg, where Martin Heidegger awaited, not as destiny, but as the next turn in a life already marked by courage and contradiction. But before we arrive at Heidegger, we pause here, in Königsberg, to see the foundations, a city of ghosts, a family marked by illness and politics, a child who refused obedience, a girl who carried grief and defiance in equal measure. This is where Hannah Arendt began, not in scandal, not in philosophy, but in the stubborn insistence of a child who refused to stop asking questions. In the autumn of 1924, Hannah Arendt arrived in Marburg, a quiet university town nestled along the Lahn River. She was just 18, armed with brilliance, restlessness, and a defiant independence that had already unsettled teachers in Königsberg. Now, she stood on the threshold of a new world. University life promised freedom. Freedom from her provincial upbringing, freedom to pursue philosophy in earnest, freedom to test her mind against the greatest thinkers of her time. Marburg, though small, was alive with intellectual energy. The university had a reputation for rigorous theology and philosophy. Students roamed cobblestone streets, crowded into lecture halls, filled cafes with arguments about Kant, Hegel, and the future of Germany. It was here that Hannah first encountered the man who would shape and haunt her intellectual and personal life, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was already a rising star. At 35, he had a reputation for brilliance that bordered on myth. His lectures were packed, his delivery electrifying. He spoke not of abstract concepts in the dry tones of professors, but with intensity, urgency, as if philosophy were not an academic pursuit, but a matter of life and death. For a generation of students adrift in the uncertainty of post-war Germany, Heidegger's call for authenticity, for confronting the question of being itself, was intoxicating. For Hannah Arendt, it was more than intoxicating. It was transformative. She later described the impact of his lectures as if language itself had been reborn. He spoke of existence, not as theory, but as lived experience. He demanded that philosophy confront time, finitude, mortality. To the young student who had grown up rejecting cliches, Heidegger's thought was a revelation. But soon, the relationship left the lecture hall. Heidegger noticed the brilliant young woman with sharp questions and penetrating eyes. Despite being married with children, he began an affair with her, a relationship conducted in secrecy, full of passion and risk. Hannah, just 18, was swept into a world that was at once philosophical and romantic. She found in Heidegger not only a teacher but a lover, not only intellectual fire but personal intimacy. The affair would remain one of the most controversial aspects of her life. Critics later asked, how could Arendt, who would one day expose totalitarianism, fall into such a relationship with a man who would later pledge allegiance to the Nazi Party? Was it naivete? Was it love overpowering judgment? Or was it, as Arendt herself seemed to believe, a sign that philosophy is never lived in purity, that thinkers are always entangled in contradictions? Whatever the answer, the experience left a deep imprint. Heidegger's philosophy of authenticity, his call to resist conformity, to live in awareness of mortality, became part of Arendt's intellectual DNA. Yet his personal choices, his turn toward Nazism a decade later, would become a wound she never fully healed. Their correspondence, carried across decades, reveals both passion and betrayal, intimacy and distance. Even in Marburg, she sought other influences. She studied theology, literature, and history. She read Augustine, Plato, and German poetry. She began to shape her own style of thought, narrative, historical, resistant to abstraction. Heidegger's language fascinated her, but she resisted becoming a disciple. Already, she insisted on independence. And yet, her years in Marburg were shattered by secrecy. The affair could not be public. She lived in a dual world, the student admired for her intellect, and the young woman entangled in a hidden relationship. This duality sharpened her awareness of duplicity, of the masks people wear, of the tension between public persona and private reality. Later, when she wrote about politics, she emphasized the importance of visibility, of truth in the public realm. Perhaps here we see the seed, the pain of secrecy making her crave openness. By 1926, Hannah left Marburg for Freiburg, where she studied briefly with Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. Husserl was rigorous, systematic, less intoxicating than Heidegger, but deeply precise. For Hannah, the encounter added another layer to her education, the demand for clarity. Soon after, she moved to Heidelberg to study under Karl Jaspers, the philosopher who would become her true mentor. Where Heidegger had captivated her with intensity, Jaspers offered something different: humanity. He insisted that philosophy must be communicative, rooted in dialogue, open to friendship. He treated Hannah not as a disciple, but as a peer, encouraging her independence. Under his supervision, she wrote her dissertation on St. Augustine, exploring the concept of love as a force that binds humans together. In Augustine, she found more than theology. She found a vocabulary for her deepest concerns. How do humans relate to one another? What binds us in community? How does love, or the lack of it, shape the world? These questions were not abstract to her. They were the questions of a woman who had known loss, secrecy, exile from belonging. This friendship lasted for decades, surviving exile and war. In Jaspers, she found not passion but loyalty, not secrecy but transparency. If Heidegger was the fire that burned her, Jaspers was the steady light that guided her. But the world outside the university was darkening. The 1920s in Germany were years of instability. The Weimar Republic faltered, extremist movements grew. Anti-Semitism, once background noise, grew louder. For Hannah, who was Jewish, the question of identity could not be ignored. Assimilation, once taken for granted by her parents, seemed less secure. Her philosophy was becoming political, not by choice, but by necessity. The young woman who had once been the precocious girl of Königsberg was now a philosopher in training, moving between Heidegger's passion, Husserl's rigor, and Jaspers' humanity. She was learning not only ideas, but also the contradictions of intellectual life. She was discovering that philosophy was not a sanctuary from history, but already entangled with it. And yet, she was still at the beginning. The storm had not yet broken. The Nazis were not yet in power. Exile had not yet stripped her of citizenship. For now, she was a young scholar, full of intensity, caught between mentors, caught between love and independence, caught between philosophy and politics. But already, the seeds of her future thought were visible. She saw that love was political, that secrecy shaped identity, that friendship could sustain truth, that thought must resist conformity. These insights, born in lecture halls and cafes, would one day become weapons against totalitarianism. The story of Hannah Arendt's university years is not simply the story of Heidegger's influence. It is the story of a young woman forming her independence, discovering mentors, shaping her style, and learning. Already, that philosophy is never pure. It is lived, entangled, compromised, and yet still necessary. The question remains, could this young woman, so alive with promise, foresee the darkness gathering around her? Could she imagine the Gestapo cell, the refugee camp, the courtroom in Jerusalem? But she was preparing, even unknowingly, for the century that would demand from her the hardest truths. By 1926, Hannah Arendt had left Marburg and Heidegger's orbit behind, at least outwardly. She carried his fire within her, but she was determined to chart her own path. Her move to Heidelberg was more than academic. It was a deliberate step toward independence. Here, under Karl Jaspers, she would find a teacher who shaped her not through seduction or secrecy, but through friendship, honesty, and respect. Jaspers was already a respected philosopher, older than Heidegger and far different in temperament. Where Heidegger had cultivated an aura of enigmatic genius, Jaspers believed in clarity and communication. For him, philosophy was not a private revelation, but a dialogue between human beings. He stressed openness, sincerity, and the courage to confront truth together. In Arendt, he recognized a mind of exceptional independence, and instead of trying to mold her into a disciple, he encouraged her autonomy. The bond between them was immediate and lasting. Jaspers treated Arendt not as a mere student, but as a thinker in her own right. He engaged her in correspondence, invited her into his intellectual circle, and encouraged her to pursue questions that mattered to her personally. Their friendship would endure across decades, surviving war, exile, and controversy. When she later faced isolation after Eichmann in Jerusalem, Jaspers remained loyal. Under his guidance, Erin completed her dissertation in 1929, Love and St. Augustine. It was an unusual choice for a young Jewish woman in Weimar Germany. Augustine was a Christian church father, steeped in theology. But for Arendt, he offered more than doctrine. She was fascinated by his exploration of love, not as sentiment, but as a force that binds humans to each other and to the world. Her dissertation examined how Augustine described love as both grounding and dangerous. Grounding because it connected people, dangerous because misplaced love could lead to domination or withdrawal from the world. For Arendt, this early focus foreshadowed her lifelong concern. How do human beings live together? What sustains community? What happens when bonds are broken? Even in this early work, her distinct style was visible. She resisted abstraction, preferring historical narrative and concrete examples. She was already weaving philosophy with lived experience, already suspicious of systems that ignored the messiness of life. Augustine became, for her, not a distant theologian but a partner in dialogue across centuries. But as she defended her dissertation and began her scholarly life, the world outside was shifting violently. The late 1920s in Germany were a time of instability. The Wall Street crash of 1929 plunged the economy into crisis. Hyperinflation, already devastating earlier in the decade, was joined now by mass unemployment. Extremist parties flourished. The Nazis, still considered fringe by many intellectuals, were gaining seats in parliament. Street violence between communists and nationalists grew common. For Arendt, the question of philosophy's role became sharper. Could one retreat into Augustine while the Republic collapsed? Could one speak of eternal truths while neighbors shouted for scapegoats? Already, she sensed that philosophy and politics were not separate realms. They collided in every street, every headline, every prejudice. Being Jewish in this atmosphere was not an abstract category, it was a lived vulnerability. Though her family had long been secular and assimilated, Anna could not escape the growing hostility. She watched as anti-Semitic stereotypes hardened into political mobilization. She saw how friends reassured themselves that reason would prevail, that Hitler was a temporary demagogue, that the institutions of the Republic would hold. But she was not so easily convinced. Here again we see the core of Arendt, her refusal of comforting illusions. Where others clung to hope that the storm would pass, she suspected that the storm was the new reality. This was the same clarity that would later scandalize her readers, her insistence that truth must be faced, however painful. Her personal life, too, was changing. She had ended her romantic entanglement with Heidegger, though their correspondence continued. She sought new relationships, both intellectual and personal, and began to situate herself within Jewish intellectual circles. She read Hebrew literature, studied Jewish history, and confronted the tension between assimilation and identity. For Arendt, identity was never simple. She resisted being defined solely as Jewish, yet she recognized that the world would not allow her to forget it. This ambivalence, both resistance to labels and insistence on truth, would mark her political thought. In Heidelberg, she also cultivated friendships that deepened her sense of belonging. But belonging was fragile. She was a young Jewish woman in a profession dominated by men, in a society increasingly hostile to her presence. The contradictions were everywhere: brilliance and marginalization, ambition and precariousness, identity chosen and identity imposed. Her dissertation complete, she might have hoped for an academic future. But 1933 was approaching. Hitler's rise to power would shatter the possibility of a normal career. The girl from Königsberg, the student of Heidegger, the protege of Jaspers, she would soon become a refugee, stripped of nationality, defined by survival. Looking back, one can see how her years with Jaspers prepared her. From him, she learned the importance of communication, of truth shared between individuals. From Augustine, she absorbed the conviction that love is not sentiment, but a force that can build or destroy communities. From her own observation of Weimar Germany, She grasped that philosophy cannot retreat from politics, that the question of how we live together is not academic, but urgent. These lessons would follow her into exile, into Paris, into New York, into Jerusalem. But for now, in Heidelberg, she was still a young scholar, full of promise, not yet marked by arrest or statelessness. She was, as she later recalled, both free and vulnerable. The vulnerability would soon be tested. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. The fragile republic collapsed into dictatorship. Hannah Arendt, Jewish, outspoken, defiant, would be among the first to feel its weight. But before Exile, before America, before Scandal, there was Heidelberg, the city where Hannah Arendt completed her first work, forged her independence, and learned that philosophy is never safe from history. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. For millions, it seemed a temporary aberration. Politicians reassured themselves that conservative elites would contain him, that the institutions of the Republic would restrain him, that reason and order would return. But for Hannah Arendt, still in her 20s, the truth was already visible. She had grown up in a world where words often disguised reality, and she had trained herself to hear the hollowness in slogans. What she heard in Hitler's speeches was not bluster but intent. By then, Arendt was living in Berlin. She had finished her dissertation under Jaspers and was working on a biography of Rahel Varnhagen, a Jewish woman of the early 19th century who embodied both assimilation and exclusion. It was a fitting subject for a thinker whose own life was about to be torn between belonging and expulsion. As the Nazis consolidated power, Hannah moved from philosophy into action. She joined Jewish organizations, helped document anti-Semitic propaganda, and assisted in gathering evidence of Nazi policies. For her, this was not a shift, but a continuation. Thought was never separate from life. To think clearly was to act, and to act was to resist. Her activism did not go unnoticed. In 1933, she was arrested by the Gestapo. For 8 days she was interrogated, accused of working against the regime. In later years, she rarely spoke about the experience, but she acknowledged its significance. She had glimpsed the machinery of terror from the inside, and she understood that remaining in Germany meant death or imprisonment. Released unexpectedly, perhaps because she was not yet a prominent figure, Hannah fled. With her mother, she crossed into Czechoslovakia and then into Switzerland, finally arriving in Paris. She left behind not only her academic ambitions, but also the illusion of security. She later said, "I was no longer of the opinion that one can simply be a philosopher. I decided that I would be political." Paris in the 1930s was both refuge and struggle. For thousands of Jewish exiles, it was a place of limbo. Hannah threw herself into refugee work, helping Jewish youth prepare for emigration to Palestine. She organized, wrote, and advocated, not as an academic, but as a political actor. For the first time, she was living in the world of pariahs, those without citizenship, without rights, without recognition. It was here that she began developing one of her most profound insights. The condition of statelessness reveals the fragility of human dignity. Her work was practical, but also philosophical. She saw how bureaucracy could reduce people to numbers, how refugees became cases instead of persons. She saw how easy it was for governments to look away, to pass the problem to others. She recognized that the true crisis of modern politics was not only violence, but abandonment. The abandonment of those stripped of belonging. Paris also brought her Heinrich Blücher, the man who would become her husband. Blücher was a former communist, an intellectual with no formal education, a man of passion and defiance. Where Heidegger had offered intellectual fire laced with secrecy, Blücher offered companionship laced with argument. Their relationship was tempestuous, but it gave Hannah a partner who shared her refusal of conformity. Together, they would endure exile, poverty, and displacement. But France was not safe for long. When Germany invaded in 1940, Jews and refugees were immediately targeted. Hannah was arrested once again, this time by French authorities, and sent to Gurs, an internment camp for enemy aliens. She was imprisoned with thousands of women, many of whom would later be deported to Auschwitz. Somehow, she escaped. Accounts differ on how, and fled south, making her way across Vichy, France. By 1941, through extraordinary effort and luck, Hannah and Blucher secured passage to America. They carried little more than what they could fit in a suitcase. Hannah had no nationality, no financial security, no academic position. What she carried instead was survival, and the conviction that exile itself had philosophical meaning. In later years, she would write, "We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions." Yet she also believed that refugees saw truths others ignored. They were the vanguard of history. This period, her arrest by the Gestapo, her years in Paris, her internment at Gurs, was formative not only personally, but intellectually. It was here she began to see the outlines of what she would later call the origins of totalitarianism. The destruction of belonging, the reduction of humans to statelessness, the use of bureaucracy to erase individuality. These were not abstractions. She had lived them. By the time she reached New York in 1941, Hannah Arendt was no longer simply a philosopher. She was a refugee who had passed through danger, survived imprisonment, and begun to see politics not as theory but as the ground of human existence. Her voice would never again be detached. She would write not as an academic observer, but as someone who had seen what happens when politics collapses into terror. The young woman who had once studied Augustine under Jaspers, who had once been captivated by Heidegger's passion, was now hardened by experience. She had discovered a truth that would never leave her. The greatest danger is not merely violence, but the world's indifference to the vulnerable. In New York, she would rebuild her life. She would write, teach, and think. But the refugee, the pariah, would remain within her. It would shape her questions, sharpen her insights, and prepare her to confront the world with words as fearless as her life had been. Paris in the late 1930s was a city vibrating with uncertainty. For Hannah Arendt, it was both a place of refuge and a staging ground for her next transformation. She arrived there in 1933, a young scholar stripped of her homeland, stripped of academic prospects, and marked as an outsider. Yet she was not defeated. Paris gave her new purpose: work for her people, work for refugees, work for survival. Arendt quickly connected with networks of Jewish organizations that were trying desperately to prepare young Jews for emigration to Palestine. She believed in this work, not as a Zionist dreamer, but as a realist who saw danger in Europe. She was pragmatic, organizing, and advocating, while also deepening her understanding of what it meant to be Jewish in a world that was increasingly hostile. It was in Paris that she encountered figures who shaped her vision of Jewish identity. She studied Rahel Varnhagen, the 19th century Jewish woman whose life she was writing about, and found in her a symbol of the tragedy of assimilation. Rahel had tried to belong to German high society, only to discover that her Jewishness remained inescapable. For Hannah, this was no distant story, it was a mirror. She saw in Rahel the fate of many Jews in Weimar Germany who had believed themselves secure, only to find that belonging could be revoked overnight. Her own life reflected the same contradiction. She was secular, modern, cosmopolitan, yet the world insisted she was first and foremost Jewish. Instead of fleeing from this imposed identity, Arendt began to confront it. She embraced her Jewishness, not as assimilation, not as nationalism, but as reality. She would later call this stance conscious pariahhood, the acceptance of exclusion as a basis for truth. Paris also gave her Heinrich Blücher. He was not an academic, but a man of revolutionary politics, once aligned with communists, skeptical of dogma, devoted to intellectual freedom. The relationship was passionate, quarrelsome, enduring. With him, Hannah found not secrecy, but partnership. They married in 1940, just before the world around them collapsed again. When Germany invaded France, Hannah's life plunged once more into danger. She was arrested by French authorities as an enemy alien, not because she was Jewish, but because she carried a German passport. She was sent to the internment camp at Gurs, a sprawling, makeshift prison in southern France. Conditions were harsh, barracks crowded, sanitation poor, food scarce. Many of the women imprisoned there would eventually be deported east to their deaths. Hannah somehow escaped. The details remain uncertain. Some say she simply walked out in the chaos after France's defeat, others that sympathetic guards allowed her to flee. What matters is that she survived, once again, by daring, by luck, and by her refusal to accept confinement. She reunited with Blücher in Marseille, and together they sought a path out of Europe. The escape was a race against time. Through a network of aid workers, including the remarkable Varian Fry, they secured visas. In May 1941, after months of uncertainty, Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher boarded a ship to America. They carried with them little money, few possessions, and no assurance of the future. What they carried most was survival and the knowledge that they had left millions behind. Arriving in New York, Arendt was at once anonymous and alive. She had lost Germany, lost France, lost her academic standing, lost her language as a natural medium. She was, as she would later write, one of the stateless, stripped of citizenship, existing only by the grace of temporary papers. We became aware, she wrote, that the loss of our home and political status meant the loss of the whole texture of life. And yet, exile was not only loss. For Arendt, it was also revelation. Statelessness revealed to her the fragility of all human institutions, the contingency of rights, the precariousness of belonging. It stripped life to its essentials: friendship, thought, courage. Out of this experience, she would later craft her most original political insights. New York was not Paris, and it was certainly not Königsberg. It was vast, chaotic, indifferent. For a refugee, it could feel alienating. Yet it also offered possibility. Hannah quickly immersed herself in the émigré intellectual community: poets, writers, and scholars who, like her, had fled Europe. In cafes and apartments, she debated, argued, laughed, and mourned. Exile was lonely, but it was also communal. In these first American years, she struggled financially. She worked for refugee organizations, wrote articles in German for émigré journals, and slowly began to find her voice in English. It was not easy. Language was identity, and losing German as her natural tongue was like losing part of herself. Yet she learned to write in English with precision and force, turning exile into a new medium of thought. Looking back, one can see the turning point clearly. Hannah Arendt had left Europe not only geographically, but intellectually. She was no longer simply a scholar of Augustine, no longer simply a student of Heidegger or Jaspers. She was a refugee who had lived statelessness, imprisonment, flight. Her philosophy would never again be detached. From now on, it would be rooted in experience, in history, in politics. This was the end of her early formation. The child of Königsberg, the student of Heidegger, the protege of Jaspers, the refugee of Paris. She had become Hannah Arendt, the thinker forged in exile. The next act of her life would unfold in America, where she would rebuild from nothing and write the works that would make her one of the most controversial and enduring voices of the 20th century. She had lost her homeland, she had lost security, but she had not lost thought. And that, for Arendt, was everything. When Hannah Arendt arrived in New York in 1941, she was 34 years old. She had lived through the collapse of Weimar democracy, the rise of Hitler, arrest by the Gestapo, internment in France, and flight across continents. She had lost her father young, lost her homeland as an adult, and now stood stateless on the shores of America. For many refugees, this was an end, a life broken beyond repair. But for Arendt, it was the beginning of her most creative period. At first, survival was the only concern. She spoke little English, had no steady income, and relied on a network of émigré friends to find odd jobs. She worked as a journalist, translator, and writer for German-language publications in the exile community. She reviewed books, wrote essays, and immersed herself in the intellectual life of displaced Europeans. Among them were poets like W. H. Auden, novelists like Thomas Mann, and fellow philosophers like Hans Jonas. In these circles, conversation was survival. For émigrés, ideas were currency, friendship was resistance, and argument was a form of staying alive. Arendt thrived in this world, bringing her sharp humor and fearless clarity. Friends recalled her laughter, her intensity, her way of speaking as if thought itself were urgent. But behind the energy was a deeper transformation. Exile had forced Arendt to see politics not as theory, but as reality. In New York, she began writing not only about Jewish identity, but about the fate of politics itself in the modern age. She was beginning to frame the questions that would define her work. What happens when people are stripped of belonging? How do mass movements mobilize loneliness? What does it mean when bureaucracies become instruments of destruction? Her first major project in America was The Origins of Totalitarianism. She worked on it throughout the 1940s, piecing together history, theory, and her own experience. It was not simply an academic book, it was an attempt to make sense of the unprecedented. The rise of Nazism and Stalinism had shattered old categories. Tyranny and dictatorship were familiar. But totalitarianism was something new, a system that sought not only obedience but the annihilation of individuality itself. The book argued that totalitarianism was born of two forces, anti-Semitism and imperialism. These forces, she said, converged in the 20th century to create movements that dissolved the individual into the mass. What made totalitarianism unique was its ambition to dominate not only actions but thought, to make human beings into replaceable parts of a machine. Arendt's analysis was bold, unsparing, and unsettling. She described how loneliness became fertile ground for ideology, how masses deprived of connection could be mobilized by leaders offering simplistic answers. She showed how bureaucracy could become an instrument of terror, making murder into paperwork, turning genocide into a matter of schedules and quotas. When the book was published in 1951, it was a sensation. For exiles, it gave voice to what they had lived. For Americans, it offered a warning that modernity itself carried dangers beyond the battlefield. Arendt insisted that Nazism was not an aberration, but a possibility rooted in modern society. This claim set her apart from both conservatives, who wanted to see Nazism as madness, and Marxists, who wanted to see it as capitalism's accident. She argued instead that it revealed something about the fragility of human community itself. The success of Origins established Arendt as a major voice in political thought, but it also made her enemies. Critics accused her of oversimplification, of exaggeration, of failing to provide a neat solution. Arendt did not care. She was not interested in solutions. She was interested in truth, in description, in clarity. She once said, "I don't write to persuade, I write to understand." In New York, she was beginning to build a career as a teacher as well as a writer. She lectured at universities, first as a guest and later in more permanent posts. Her accent remained heavy, her style unusual, but students found her electrifying. She demanded engagement, not repetition. She did not want disciples. She wanted argument, resistance, thought. Yet her life in America was not only intellectual. With Heinrich Blücher, she built a home in Riverside Drive. Their marriage was unconventional, marked by quarrels, infidelities, and reconciliations, but it endured. Friends recalled their evenings full of wine, arguments, and laughter. Arendt's warmth and wit made her a magnetic presence, though her sharpness could also cut. She made close friendships but also lost them easily when honesty demanded it. Despite her new life, she never forgot the refugee experience. Stateless for nearly 2 decades, she became an American citizen in 1951, the same year Origins was published. She celebrated, but she never romanticized it. Citizenship was precious because she had known life without it. This experience led her to one of her most profound insights, that the foundation of human dignity is the right to have rights. Without a political community to guarantee them, rights are empty promises. In New York, Arendt was both insider and outsider. She became part of American intellectual life, publishing in English, lecturing widely, influencing debates. Yet she remained a European exile at heart, marked by loss, writing with an accent, rooted in memories of Königsberg, Marburg, Heidelberg, and Paris. She was both American and not, both at home and not, a duality she accepted. The 1950s were years of productivity and recognition. She wrote essays on politics, freedom, and revolution. She engaged in debates about the Cold War, about McCarthyism, about the meaning of democracy. She was never predictable, never aligning neatly with left or right. For some, this made her frustrating. For others, it made her indispensable. But even as she thrived, she remained haunted. The question of evil, the meaning of thoughtlessness, the fragility of politics. These were not academic puzzles. They were scars. She carried the memory of Gurs, the knowledge of millions murdered, the experience of flight and statelessness. And she carried the conviction that only thought relentless, fearless, honest thought could resist the temptation to surrender. By the end of the 1950s, Arendt was a respected intellectual, a citizen, a teacher, and a writer. But the event that would define her reputation and nearly destroy her friendships was approaching. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina would bring her face to face with the embodiment of her central question: what if evil comes not as a monster, but as an ordinary man who refuses to think? By the early 1950s, Hannah Arendt had achieved something few refugees managed. She had become not just a survivor, but a recognized intellectual voice in her adopted country. The origins of totalitarianism had given her a place among America's most significant thinkers, but it was in her teaching and her friendships that her ideas deepened into the distinctive voice that would soon shake the world. Teaching did not come easily at first. Her German accent was thick, her English occasionally abrupt, and her style idiosyncratic. Yet what students encountered was unlike anything they had known. She did not lecture from prepared notes, nor did she repeat the safe canon. Instead, she treated every classroom as a conversation in progress. Philosophy, she insisted, was not about memorization, but about judgment. Think what we are doing, she would say, borrowing a phrase that captured her entire method. Students were both intimidated and inspired. Some found her brilliance overwhelming. Others discovered in her teaching a rare invitation to independence. One recalled that she was the only professor who demanded they argue back, that agreement was worthless unless it was earned through resistance. Arendt wanted her students to be alive in thought, not docile in agreement. In these years, she taught at a series of universities: Berkeley, Princeton, the University of Chicago, and eventually the New School in New York, where she found her most enduring home. Her reputation grew, and though she never enjoyed the security of tenure in her early years, she became one of the most sought-after lecturers in political theory. Alongside teaching, Arendt built a network of friendships that sustained her through the difficulties of exile and controversy. Chief among these was her bond with the novelist and critic Mary McCarthy. Their friendship was fierce, witty, and loyal, born of shared candor. McCarthy adored Arendt's honesty, her refusal to flatter, her brilliance that could light up a dinner table. In return, Arendt found in McCarthy a friend who understood that disagreement was not betrayal, but intimacy. The two women became legendary for their conversations, full of laughter, sharp critique, and warmth. McCarthy would later defend Arendt during the storm of Eichmann in Jerusalem, when others abandoned her. Their letters reveal affection and candor, as when McCarthy teased Arendt for her seriousness, or Arendt rebuked McCarthy for romanticizing revolutions. It was a friendship that survived storms, precisely because it was rooted in truth rather than comfort. Other friendships shaped her life as well. She remained close to Karl Jaspers, corresponding with him across decades and continents. His humanity, his steadiness, his refusal of dogma continued to nourish her. In contrast, her relationship with Martin Heidegger remained fraught. They corresponded intermittently, their letters revealing unresolved passion, disappointment, and intellectual kinship. For Arendt, Heidegger was both wound and influence, never reconciled but never erased. Her marriage to Heinrich Blücher continued as the anchor of her personal life. Their home on Riverside Drive became a gathering place for émigrés, poets, and thinkers. Guests remembered evenings of wine, cigarette smoke, and relentless argument. Arendt and Blücher did not play the role of a conventional academic couple. Their partnership was messy, full of quarrels and reconciliations. But it endured because it was built on intellectual respect and mutual freedom. They allowed each other infidelities, disagreements, and independence. For Hannah, this unconventional bond was not a weakness, but a source of strength. Meanwhile, her writing evolved. After Origins, she turned to questions of freedom, revolution, and authority. In Essays and Lectures, she argued that politics was not primarily about managing interests, but about action, about appearing in the public world and taking responsibility. She distinguished between labor, work, and action, labor as survival, work as creation, action as the uniquely human capacity to begin anew. This framework would later culminate in her 1958 masterpiece, The Human Condition. In that book, she offered a vision of politics as the realm where humans reveal themselves to one another through speech and action. Against both Marxist economic reduction and liberal proceduralism, she insisted that politics was not a means to an end, but a way of being fully human. To act politically was to step into the world, to risk oneself in the company of others, to create something that had never been before. The book was both celebrated and criticized. Some praised its originality, others found it abstract. Yet it established Arendt as a thinker who could not be confined to categories. She was neither liberal nor conservative, neither Marxist nor nationalist. She was, simply, Arendt, a voice demanding that we see politics as the space of human freedom and warning that when politics collapses into conformity or bureaucracy, humanity itself is endangered. The 1950s also brought her to the United States' own political crises. McCarthyism, with its witch hunts and loyalty oaths, troubled her deeply. She did not equate it with totalitarianism. America remained a democracy, but she saw in it the danger of fear eroding freedom. She warned that democracy could be undermined not only by coups, but by conformity, by the slow surrender of courage in the face of intimidation. Through these years, Arendt's central question sharpened. What does it mean to think, and what happens when thinking stops? She was preparing, though she did not yet know it, for the confrontation that would make her most infamous, the trial of Adolf Eichmann. By the end of the 1950s, Hannah Arendt stood as a recognized public intellectual, respected, controversial, admired, and feared. She had a circle of friends who sustained her, a community of students who admired her, a body of work that marked her as original. Yet she remained restless. She believed philosophy was never finished, that each moment of history demanded new questions. Then, in 1960, Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. The news electrified the world. For Arendt, it was not only news, it was fate. She would go to Jerusalem to witness the trial. She would confront her question in flesh and blood. Could evil truly be banal? The storm was coming. But for now, in her teaching years, in her friendships, in her writing, Hannah Arendt was sharpening the tools she would need to survive it. In May 1960, news broke that Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, had been captured in Argentina by Israeli agents and brought to Jerusalem for trial. Across the world, survivors, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens felt a shock of recognition. Eichmann's name was infamous among Jews who had survived the camps and the deportations. He had overseen the logistics of the final solution, the trains, the timetables, the deportations. He was a symbol of the machinery that had turned human lives into schedules. For Hannah Arendt, now a respected intellectual in New York, the news stirred something deeper. This was not only about justice. It was about a question that had haunted her since her youth. How had ordinary people become complicit in horror? Here, in Eichmann, was a chance to see the face of bureaucratic evil. She proposed to The New Yorker that she cover the trial. The magazine agreed, and in 1961 she traveled to Jerusalem. Survivors testified in harrowing detail about transports, camps, gas chambers, and wasps. The courtroom was filled with journalists, politicians, and an audience that understood it was witnessing not only legal proceedings but history itself. For many, Eichmann was expected to be a monster, a sadistic figure whose presence would embody the horror he had helped unleash. But when Arendt looked into the glass booth where Eichmann sat, she saw something else. He was not demonic. He was not charismatic. He was not even particularly intelligent. He was, in her words, terrifyingly normal. He spoke in cliches, in bureaucratic jargon, in phrases that sounded borrowed from manuals and orders. He insisted that he had simply followed directives, that he bore no personal hatred, that he was a small cog in a great machine. He did not rage or gloat. He repeated stock phrases about duty, loyalty, and necessity. To Arendt, this ordinariness was more chilling than any display of malice. What she saw in Eichmann was not monstrous hatred, but thoughtlessness. He had abdicated his responsibility to think. He had stopped asking whether his actions were right or wrong. He had replaced judgment with obedience, conscience with routine. For Arendt, this was the heart of the matter. Evil did not always roar with demonic passion. Sometimes it whispered in cliches. She coined the phrase, the banality of evil, to describe what she saw. By this, she did not mean that the crimes were banal. They were vast, horrific, and unprecedented. She meant that the person committing them was banal, a man without depth, without imagination, without reflection. The horror was precisely this, that millions could be killed not by demons, but by bureaucrats. Her reports, published in The New Yorker and later in book form as Eichmann in Jerusalem, ignited a firestorm. Survivors accused her of minimizing Eichmann's guilt. Jewish leaders accused her of betraying her people. Intellectuals accused her of cold detachment. Her observation that some Jewish councils, under unbearable coercion, had facilitated deportations drew particular outrage. She was condemned as insensitive, even cruel. But Arendt insisted she was not excusing Eichmann. She had argued that he deserved the death penalty, and she did not question his guilt. What she was challenging was the way people understood evil itself. If Eichmann was monstrous, then evil could be kept at a distance. But if Eichmann was ordinary, then evil was far closer, woven into the capacity of anyone who refuses to think. The scandal was not only about her analysis. It was about what it forced readers to see. If Eichmann was ordinary, then the line between innocence and complicity was thinner than people wanted to believe. Evil was not the property of the other. It was a possibility within everyone. Arendt's phrase entered the world like a provocation. It was misunderstood, simplified, debated endlessly. Some took it to mean that the Holocaust was trivial, which horrified her. Others saw in it a warning that bureaucracy itself was dangerous. Still others recognized it as the unsettling insight she intended, that thoughtlessness is the seed of atrocity. For Arendt personally, the cost was immense. Old friends broke ties. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, accused her of lacking love for the Jewish people. She replied that she had never loved a people, only her friends. This was characteristic. Arendt defiant, uncompromising, unwilling to speak words she did not mean. The controversy nearly destroyed her reputation, but it also ensured her legacy. No one could forget the phrase. No one could erase the question it raised. What if evil comes not from hatred but from emptiness, not from passion but from refusal to think? In the courtroom in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt was not only watching Eichmann, she was holding up a mirror to the 20th century. What she saw in him was the shadow of modern bureaucracy, the danger of conformity, the fragility of thought. The man in the glass booth was not only Eichmann, he was the terrifying possibility of every society that forgets the responsibility of judgment. When the trial ended, Eichmann was sentenced to death and executed in 1962. The world moved on. But Arendt's question remained. And for her, it was only the beginning. She would spend the rest of her career returning to it. What does it mean to think? How can thinking guard against evil? What is freedom if it is not exercised in judgment? The scandal of Eichmann marked both a wound and a turning point. Arendt had crossed a line from which she could not retreat. She was no longer just an émigré intellectual. She was a global figure, admired and reviled, destined to spend the rest of her life defending, clarifying, and expanding the idea that evil might not look like a monster, but like a man in a glass booth, speaking cliches. The storm that followed Eichmann in Jerusalem was unlike anything Hannah Arendt had yet endured. She was no stranger to controversy. Her writings on Zionism, on Jewish politics, and on totalitarianism had always provoked disagreement. But the reception of her Eichmann book was something else. It was not merely intellectual debate. It was personal, visceral, furious. Jewish leaders accused her of betrayal. Survivors felt she had trivialized their suffering. Friends who had shared her exile and understood her integrity now denounced her publicly. Some refused to speak to her again. Invitations dried up, relationships shattered, old alliances dissolved. What stung most was the accusation of heartlessness. Readers claimed she had failed to show compassion for victims, that her analysis was cold, detached, unfeeling. But Arendt believed she had been faithful to truth. She insisted that her duty was not to console, but to describe. It is not the role of the thinker, she said, to provide comfort, but to face reality without veils. She was particularly wounded by the reaction to her comments on the Jewish councils. She had observed, factually, that under Nazi coercion, Jewish leaders had sometimes facilitated deportations, believing cooperation might save lives. This was a terrible reality, but Arendt believed it had to be acknowledged, not erased. To her critics, however, the remark felt like blaming victims, reopening wounds that were already unbearable. The break with Gershom Scholem was emblematic. He accused her in a famous letter of lacking ahavat Yisrael, love of the Jewish people. Arendt replied with characteristic bluntness, "I have never in my life loved any people or collective. I indeed love only my friends, and am utterly incapable of any other love." For her, politics could not be built on collective sentiment. It had to be built on truth and responsibility. But her honesty came at a cost. The experience left her isolated, yet it also crystallized her next philosophical turn. She began to ask more urgently, what does it mean to think? If Eichmann represented the absence of thought, what then is the nature of true thinking? If banality was the danger, how could depth protect against it? These questions guided her next major project, The Life of the Mind. It was an ambitious attempt to explore the faculties of thinking, willing, and judging. For Arendt, thinking was not the accumulation of knowledge, but the activity of dialogue with oneself. To think was to resist cliché, to confront reality, to hold oneself accountable. She argued that Eichmann's evil came not from ideology alone, but from the refusal of this inner dialogue. He avoided the question, should I do this? He replaced conscience with obedience. In his inability to think, Arendt saw the seed of atrocity. Thus, she suggested, the act of thinking itself is a moral safeguard, not because it produces goodness automatically, but because it keeps the individual awake, present, responsible. Her reflections on judgment went further. She drew on Kant's idea of enlarged mentality, the capacity to see from the perspective of others. For Arendt, judgment was not about abstract rules, but about considering the plurality of human experience. Evil, she suggested, grows when this capacity collapses, when one can no longer imagine the standpoint of others, when one lives only in clichés. Though The Life of the Mind remained unfinished at her death, these late writings show how deeply the Eichmann controversy shaped her. It forced her to move beyond politics into philosophy, to connect action with thought, judgment with responsibility. Meanwhile, in public, she continued to lecture and write. Her students and allies defended her, even as critics continued to circle. Mary McCarthy, loyal as ever, insisted that Arendt's sharpness was not cruelty but courage. Carl Jaspers, from across the Atlantic, reassured her that truth would outlast scandal. But the wounds of lost friendships never fully healed. Despite the pain, Arendt never recanted. She believed that her role as a thinker was to describe reality as she saw it, without distortion, without compromise. She once remarked, "The only obligation of the thinker is to be in dialogue with reality." To betray that obligation, she felt, would be worse than losing friends. By the late 1960s, Arendt had become both revered and reviled. She was invited to speak at universities across America and Europe, often to packed halls, sometimes to hostile audiences. She relished debate, even confrontation. She had no desire to be loved universally. What she wanted was thought to provoke it, to demand it, to awaken it. And she was not done provoking. In her writings on revolution, she praised the American experiment while criticizing modern political systems for reducing citizens to spectators. In essays on violence, she challenged the leftist movements of the 1960s, insisting that violence might destroy but never create freedom. Again and again, she resisted ideological camps, insisting on independence of judgment. The aftermath of the Eichmann trial, then, was both a wound and a gift. It cost her friendships, but it gave her a new depth. It forced her to turn inward, to ask what thinking itself meant, and to place that question at the center of philosophy. The thinker, who had once fled stateless through Europe, who had once analyzed totalitarianism from afar, had now confronted evil directly and carried its lesson into the heart of philosophy. Hannah Arendt had been accused of cruelty. But perhaps, as her writing suggests, her true crime was clarity, the refusal to soften truths for the sake of comfort. And in that refusal, she remained faithful not only to herself, but to the very possibility of thought. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Hannah Arendt was no longer only the author of The Origins of Totalitarianism. She had become a central voice in political thought, shaping debates about freedom, democracy, and the meaning of human life in the modern world. The scandal of Eichmann in Jerusalem had made her infamous, but her philosophical works of this period revealed a thinker unwilling to retreat into mere polemics. Instead, she sought to reimagine politics itself. In 1958, she published The Human Condition, perhaps her most ambitious and enduring book. In it, she distinguished between three fundamental activities of human life: labor, work, and action. Labor referred to the endless cycle of biological necessity, the tasks that sustain life but never escape repetition. Work referred to the creation of durable things, buildings, tools, art, institutions. Action, however, was for Arendt the highest form of human activity, the realm of speech and deeds, where individuals reveal themselves to one another in freedom. This framework was radical in its simplicity. Against traditions that prioritized contemplation or economic production, Arendt insisted that politics, the space where humans act together in plurality, was the true condition of human dignity. To be human was not merely to survive or to create, but to appear before others, to act and speak in the shared world. Her critique of modernity followed naturally. In modern societies, she argued, labor and work had been elevated while action had been diminished. Economies and technologies flourished, but politics was reduced to administration, to bureaucracy, to a stage managed by elites. Citizens became spectators rather than actors. Democracy risked becoming hollow, a theater where genuine freedom was absent. For readers accustomed to Cold War categories, capitalism versus communism, liberalism versus socialism, Arendt's voice was disorienting. She fit none of the camps. She admired the American Revolution more than the French, not because of nationalism, but because she believed the American founders had preserved a space for action, for the ongoing experiment of self-government. She praised the councils and assemblies that emerged spontaneously in revolutions, where citizens discovered their own power. But she distrusted centralized power, even when justified in the name of liberation. This perspective shaped her next major work, On Revolution, 1963. There, she contrasted the American and French revolutions. The French, she argued, had been consumed by the social question, poverty, hunger, inequality, and had therefore descended into violence. The American, by contrast, had preserved a focus on political freedom, on the creation of institutions that allowed citizens to act together. Her critics bristled. How could she dismiss the importance of economic justice? How could she seem to romanticize the American founders while minimizing slavery, exclusion, and inequality? Arendt did not deny these realities, but she insisted that the essence of revolution lay in its political form, not its social demands. For her, freedom meant participation in the public realm, not simply the satisfaction of needs. This insistence made her an outlier. The left found her blind to economic oppression. The right found her too radical in her emphasis on citizen power. Yet for those who listened closely, she was describing something deeper, the danger that politics itself might vanish, replaced either by administration or by violence. Her essays of the 1960s extended this argument into contemporary debates. In On Violence, 1970, written in the wake of student protests and revolutionary movements, she warned that violence could never create freedom. It might destroy institutions, but it could not build the space of action necessary for politics. This put her at odds with radicals who saw violence as cleansing, but Arendt held firm, freedom could not be born of destruction alone. In America, these positions made her both admired and alienated. She was invited to conferences, to lectures, to debates, but she never belonged fully to any camp. Her independence was her strength and her burden. She resisted ideology in all forms, insisting that each event, each crisis, demanded fresh judgment. Personally, these years were also marked by both stability and strain. Her marriage to Heinrich Blücher continued, sustained by affection and argument. Their home remained a gathering place for émigrés, students, and friends. Yet health problems and the lingering shadows of exile never left them. Hannah often seemed both fully present in American life and permanently marked as an outsider. Her friendships provided resilience. Mary McCarthy remained her fiercest ally, defending her against critics and sharing in the laughter that made survival possible. Their letters during these years show warmth, wit, and honesty. Arendt's ability to combine seriousness with humor made her not only a formidable thinker, but also a companion who could make friends feel alive. By the close of the 1960s, Hannah Arendt had established a body of work that reshaped political theory. She had diagnosed totalitarianism, redefined human action, and challenged revolutions to honor freedom. Yet she was restless still. She felt that philosophy had not yet confronted its most urgent task: to understand what thinking itself meant in an age where evil had appeared as banal. This turn toward the philosophy of mind would define her last decade. She would explore thinking, willing, and judging as the foundations of responsibility. She would ask whether thought could guard against conformity, whether judgment could sustain freedom, whether philosophy could answer the challenge posed by the man in the glass booth in Jerusalem. But before those final questions, Hannah Arendt stood in the midst of her intellectual prime. She was controversial, admired, feared, and lonely. She had no party, no camp, no ideology. She had only her voice, the voice of a refugee who refused to flatter, who refused to conform, who insisted that to be human is to act, to speak, to think. And that voice was about to turn, in her final works, toward the most intimate question of all: what does it mean to think? By the early 1970s, Hannah Arendt stood at the height of her reputation. She had published works that redefined political thought, survived the firestorm of Eichmann in Jerusalem, and established herself as a fearless public intellectual. Yet she was not finished. The questions provoked by the trial, the meaning of thinking, the nature of judgment, the roots of responsibility, pressed on her with urgency. She knew that her next task would not be political history or revolutionary theory, but philosophy at its most intimate, the exploration of the human mind itself. The project she conceived, The Life of the Mind, would be her final and most ambitious undertaking. It was to be a 3-volume meditation on the faculties of thinking, willing, and judging. Unlike her earlier works, which moved between history and politics, this would go straight to the foundations of human consciousness. She wanted to ask not what humans do in the world, but how they experience their own interior life, and how that inner life connects to responsibility in the world. Her starting point was Eichmann. Watching him in the courtroom, Arendt had concluded that his evil lay in his refusal to think. He had abdicated the inner dialogue with himself that allows conscience to emerge. He lived in clichés, formulas, stock phrases. He had never stopped to ask, should I do this? He had avoided the silent confrontation with himself that makes judgment possible. Thus, for Arendt, the act of thinking was not academic. It was ethical. To think meant to hold oneself accountable, to refuse thoughtless obedience, to resist the banality of clichés. Thinking, she suggested, was the root of moral responsibility, not because it produced rules, but because it kept the self awake. In her lectures and manuscripts, she explored this idea through dialogue with great philosophers. She returned to Socrates, whose insistence on the examined life had always inspired her. Socrates, she said, showed that thinking was not about knowledge, but about conversation. Conversation with oneself, with others, with reality. To refuse that conversation was to risk becoming complicit in evil. She also turned to Kant, whose critique of judgment offered a vision of judgment as enlarged mentality, the capacity to see from the standpoint of others. For Arendt, judgment was not about applying universal laws, but about imagining perspectives, considering plurality, and making decisions in the absence of certainty. This was essential for politics. Without judgment, freedom collapses into ideology. Her second volume, On the Will, asked another urgent question: how do humans experience freedom? For Arendt, freedom was not simply choice, but the capacity to begin, to initiate, to start something new. She believed that the will was the inner faculty that allowed action in the world, but she also recognized the paradox of willing, the tension between necessity and freedom, between fate and initiative. Her reflections drew on Augustine, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, weaving together centuries of thought into her own distinctive vision. The third volume, which she never completed, was to be on judgment. Here, she intended to confront directly the problem left by Eichmann: how can ordinary individuals judge in the absence of absolute rules? How can one resist thoughtlessness and cultivate the capacity to see from the perspective of others? This unfinished work became her final legacy, leaving readers to imagine how she might have completed it. As she labored on the life of the mind, Arendt continued her public role. She lectured widely, her presence commanding despite her aging body. Her students described her classes as electric. She spoke with the urgency of someone for whom philosophy was not abstract but necessary. She reminded them that thinking was not optional, it was the ground of responsibility. Her personal life during these years was marked by both stability and loss. Heinrich Blücher, her husband and companion of decades, had died in 1970. His absence left her shaken, yet she continued her work with determination. She found solace in her friendships, especially with Mary McCarthy, whose wit and loyalty provided strength. Their letters from this period show Arendt's exhaustion but also her fierce commitment to completing her project. Even as her health declined, she refused to slow down. She traveled, lectured, wrote, debated. She was, as ever, uncompromising. She defended her earlier works, clarified her ideas, and continued to provoke controversy. She remained suspicious of ideologies, critical of simplifications, and devoted to the freedom of thought. By the mid-1970s, she was a figure of both admiration and controversy. Younger radicals found her too cautious, conservatives found her too radical, and academics often found her elusive. Yet she inspired intense loyalty among those who encountered her in person. Students recalled her laughter, her sharpness, her insistence that philosophy mattered in daily life. In 1975, while working on the second volume of The Life of the Mind, Hannah Arendt suffered a heart attack. She recovered enough to continue writing, but her health remained fragile. She pressed on, determined to finish her work. But in December of that year, at the age of 69, she died suddenly in her New York apartment. Her death left The Life of the Mind incomplete. The volumes on thinking and willing were published posthumously. The volume on judgment left in fragments. Yet even unfinished, the work stands as a testament to her vision. From the girl in Königsberg to the student of Heidegger, from the refugee in Paris to the émigré in New York, from the analyst of totalitarianism to the witness at Eichmann's trial. Her journey had always been about the same question: how do humans remain free and responsible in a world that tempts them to conformity? Her answer, unfinished but profound, was simple and difficult: we must think. By the early 1970s, Hannah Arendt had already lived through more history than most. She had been a child in Königsberg, a student of Heidegger and Jaspers, a refugee fleeing the Gestapo, an exile in Paris, an internee at Gurs, a stateless woman arriving in America, and, finally, a celebrated and reviled thinker at the center of the 20th century's debates. She had written books that redefined politics, provoked scandals, and reshaped philosophy. Yet her last years were marked not by triumph, but by a kind of solitude: the solitude of loss, the solitude of age, and the solitude of a thinker who never belonged to any camp. The greatest loss came in 1970, when her husband, Heinrich Blücher, died suddenly of a heart attack. They had been married for nearly 30 years. Their relationship was unconventional, sometimes turbulent, but it was also her anchor. Blücher had been her companion in exile, her partner in arguments, the one who challenged her to connect philosophy with politics. Without him, her world contracted. Friends recalled that after his death, she seemed diminished, though never defeated. She spoke of him constantly, as if he remained a presence in her conversations. In her apartment on Riverside Drive, she left his study untouched, as though he might return at any moment. His absence was a wound she never fully healed. In this period, her friendships became even more essential. Mary McCarthy was her closest confidant, a friend who combined sharpness with loyalty. Their letters from these years are filled with grief, wit, and the stubbornness of survival. McCarthy teased her, argued with her, supported her. Hannah, in turn, confided her loneliness, her exhaustion, her frustrations. For Arendt, friendship had always been a form of politics, a space where speech and truth flourished. In her final years, it was also a form of consolation. Her teaching continued, though her energy waned. At the New School in New York, students still crowded her seminars. They came not only for her insights, but for her presence. The way she spoke, as if philosophy mattered urgently, as if every concept were connected to life itself. Her laughter, her directness, her refusal to condescend left a mark on those who heard her. For many, attending her lectures was less like attending a class and more like entering into a shared act of thinking. At the same time, she pressed forward with The Life of the Mind. She knew it would be her last great work, and she worked with intensity, even as her health declined. She wrote long hours, surrounded by stacks of notes, tracing the contours of thinking, willing, and judging. She spoke of it not as an abstract project, but as a response to the world's failures. Thinking itself, she insisted, is already the beginning of resistance. Her reflections became increasingly personal. She returned to Socrates as a model of the thinker who lives in dialogue with himself, refusing to betray conscience even at the cost of death. She returned to Kant as the philosopher of judgment, whose call to think from the standpoint of others resonated with her belief in plurality. She returned to Augustine, whose meditations on the will had shaped her earliest writings. In these final years, she seemed to gather the voices of her intellectual ancestors around her, weaving them into her own last statement. Despite her fame, she remained deeply skeptical of celebrity. She disliked being treated as a symbol, as a hero, or as an oracle. She resisted being categorized as a feminist thinker, though women admired her as a pioneer. She resisted being called a liberal or a conservative, though both camps tried to claim her. She insisted that her only allegiance was to truth, however uncomfortable. Physically, her health was failing. She suffered from heart problems and fatigue, yet she rarely spoke of illness, refusing to make it the center of her identity. She continued to lecture, to host friends, to attend gatherings. She carried herself with dignity, even as her body betrayed her. On December 4th, 1975, Hannah Arendt died in her New York apartment, suddenly, of a heart attack. She was 69 years old. She left behind unfinished manuscripts, stacks of notes, and a community of friends who mourned her fiercely. She was buried beside Heinrich Blücher at Bard College, where they had both taught. Her death left a sense of incompletion, not only because The Life of the Mind was unfinished, but because her voice had been one of restless questioning. She was not a thinker who gave final answers. She was a thinker who opened questions, who demanded clarity, who insisted that philosophy remain alive to reality. Her absence felt like a silence where questions still echoed, and yet her legacy was already secure. Students, friends, and critics recognized that she had left something rare, a body of work that combined history, philosophy, and lived experience, that spoke both to the horrors of the 20th century and to the perennial dangers of human thoughtlessness. She had named The Banality of Evil, had redefined politics as action, had insisted that freedom lay not in certainties but in judgment. In her final years, Hannah Arendt had endured loneliness and loss, but she had also held firm to her conviction that to think is to resist. She had shown that philosophy is not a retreat from life, but its deepest engagement. And she had lived to the end, as she had always demanded of others. Not as a spectator, but as a participant in the fragile, unpredictable, urgent work of being human. When Hannah Arendt died in December 1975, the intellectual world responded with a mixture of mourning, relief, and uncertainty. She had been, in life, a figure who divided as much as she inspired. For some, she was the philosopher who had given language to the 20th century's horrors. For others, she was a provocateur who had wounded survivors and friends with her cold clarity. Death did not erase these tensions. If anything, it magnified them. Obituaries poured in from Europe and America. Some emphasized her role as the analyst of totalitarianism, praising the origins of totalitarianism as a monumental diagnosis of modern tyranny. Others recalled the scandal of Eichmann in Jerusalem, reminding readers of the fury she had provoked. Few wrote of her without ambivalence, yet almost all agreed on one thing: she had been impossible to ignore. At Bard College, where she was buried beside Heinrich Blücher, her students and colleagues remembered her presence in the classroom, her laughter, her sharpness, her refusal to tolerate lazy thinking. At the New School in New York, where she had made her intellectual home, the community felt the loss of a thinker who had given the institution its spirit of independence. Among émigrés, her death closed a chapter of exile. She had been one of the last great voices of the generation that fled Hitler and remade intellectual life in America. In the years immediately following her death, The Life of the Mind was published in its unfinished form. The volumes on Thinking and Willing revealed a new side of Arendt, less polemical, more intimate, deeply philosophical. Readers encountered her wrestling with Augustine, Kant, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Socrates. They saw her trying to connect the act of thinking itself with moral responsibility. The missing third volume, on Judging, became legendary in its absence, an unfinished question that haunted her legacy. Scholars speculated endlessly about what she might have written. The reception of The Life of the Mind was mixed. Some saw it as proof of her brilliance, others as too fragmentary to stand on its own, but it had the effect of reframing her reputation. If Eichmann in Jerusalem had painted her as harsh, even cruel, The Life of the Mind revealed her as a thinker of conscience, struggling with the meaning of morality in the absence of certainty. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Arendt's ideas began to circulate more widely, not only in philosophy but in political theory, sociology, and literature. Her concept of the banality of evil entered public discourse, often misused but always present. Journalists invoked it to describe bureaucratic corruption, cultural conformity, and even corporate malfeasance. The phrase lived a life of its own, often detached from her careful analysis, but carrying her voice into debates far beyond academia. Her analysis of totalitarianism gained renewed relevance during the Cold War. Scholars of communism and fascism debated her thesis that Stalinism and Nazism shared structural similarities. Critics accused her of flattening differences. Defenders argued that her framework illuminated patterns that traditional categories obscured. In Eastern Europe, dissidents found inspiration in her insistence that politics was about action, speech, and plurality. For those resisting authoritarianism, her call to act in the public realm resonated as a defense of dignity. Feminist thinkers, too, began to claim her, though Arendt herself had resisted being labeled. She had once said she did not write as a woman, but as a thinker. Yet her life as a refugee, a woman in male-dominated philosophy, and an uncompromising outsider spoke powerfully to feminist readers. They admired her independence, her refusal of categories, her insistence that freedom was the capacity to begin anew. By the 1980s, she was being read alongside Simone de Beauvoir and Iris Murdoch as one of the women who had reshaped 20th century philosophy. Her influence also spread into literature and culture. Novelists cited her insights on memory and responsibility. Playwrights and filmmakers drew on her analysis of bureaucracy and evil. Even in popular culture, references to the banality of evil appeared, sometimes serious, sometimes ironic, but always carrying the echo of her thought. At the same time, criticism persisted. Some scholars continued to accuse her of arrogance, of oversimplifying history, of misrepresenting Jewish responses to the Holocaust. Others argued that her emphasis on politics as action was too idealistic, neglecting material realities. Still others bristled at her detachment, her refusal to offer clear prescriptions. Arendt remained polarizing, a thinker admired and attacked with equal passion. Yet perhaps this was part of her legacy. She had never sought agreement. She had never wanted disciples. She wanted thought. In the decades after her passing, Hannah Arendt's legacy began to crystallize. She was the thinker who had insisted that politics is the realm of freedom, that totalitarianism was not an aberration but a danger inherent in modernity, and that evil might come not as monstrosity but as thoughtlessness. She was also the thinker who had lived her philosophy, who had fled statelessness, endured exile, and yet insisted on the dignity of action and speech. Her friends mourned her. Her critics sharpened their knives, her students remembered her voice, and her books, like her life, refused to be forgotten. In the years following her death, Hannah Arendt's writings did not fade into the shelves of academic libraries. Instead, they grew in resonance, taken up by thinkers, activists, and artists across the world. By the 1980s and 1990s, her name had become synonymous with a particular kind of intellectual courage: the refusal to accept easy answers, the insistence that freedom requires action, and the warning that evil can hide in ordinariness. One of the first arenas where her influence deepened was Eastern Europe. Dissidents living under Soviet rule read Arendt with a sense of recognition. Her descriptions of totalitarianism, the atomization of individuals, the destruction of public spaces, the rule of bureaucracy, spoke directly to their experiences. Václav Havel, later president of the Czech Republic, echoed her emphasis on truth and the public sphere in his essays. Polish activists in solidarity drew on her insistence that politics is not about ideology, but about the courage to appear in public together. For these movements, Arendt provided more than analysis. She offered hope. She had insisted that totalitarianism, for all its machinery, could never fully extinguish human freedom. The capacity to act, to begin anew, always remained. For dissidents facing prison, censorship, and repression, this was not abstract philosophy, it was encouragement. At the same time, Arendt became increasingly central in feminist thought. Though she had never claimed the title of feminist philosopher, indeed, she sometimes resisted it. Her life and work resonated with feminist concerns. She had been one of the few women to enter the male-dominated world of German philosophy, standing toe-to-toe with Heidegger, Jaspers, and others. She had insisted on her independence, rejecting labels, refusing to be confined by categories of gender. Feminist scholars in the 1980s began to read her insistence on plurality, freedom, and natality, the capacity for new beginnings, as deeply aligned with feminist visions of politics. Her concept of natality, in particular, resonated. The idea that each human being, by being born, brings the possibility of something unprecedented into the world. For feminists, this was not only a philosophical claim, but an affirmation of life, creativity, and resistance. In the wake of the Vietnam War, and later the genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, and the Balkans, jurists and human rights activists turned to her idea of the banality of evil. They found in it a warning. Atrocities are not committed only by sadists, but by administrators, soldiers, and officials who abdicate responsibility. International tribunals cited her language, journalists invoked her concepts, and human rights advocates used her framework to explain how ordinary people become perpetrators. Yet the banality of evil also continued to be misunderstood. In popular culture, the phrase was often taken to mean that evil itself was trivial, rather than that perpetrators could be ordinary. Arendt's subtle distinction, that crimes could be monstrous even when their agents were banal, was frequently flattened into cliché. Still, the phrase endured, a sign that her words had entered the bloodstream of culture. In the United States, political theorists turned increasingly to her vision of democracy. Amidst disillusionment with mass politics and bureaucratic administration, scholars found in Arendt's idea of action and plurality a way to rethink participation. She became a touchstone for debates about civic life, public space, and the fragility of freedom. Artists, too, discovered her. Plays were written inspired by her confrontation with Eichmann. Novels wove her phrases into their pages. Filmmakers borrowed her insights to depict the ordinary faces of violence. By the 1990s, her figure appeared not only in philosophy seminars but in cultural works, a sign that her thought had transcended academia. Yet she remained controversial. Some Marxist critics continue to argue that her dismissal of economic structures made her blind to capitalism's role in oppression. Others accused her of elitism, of idealizing public life while neglecting private suffering. Jewish thinkers continued to debate her harsh remarks on Jewish councils, some defending her courage, others condemning her insensitivity. Arendt's legacy was not one of consensus, but of contention. But perhaps that was fitting. Arendt had never sought to unify opinion. She had sought to provoke thought. In the 1980s and 1990s, as totalitarian regimes crumbled, as feminism redefined politics, as human rights movements confronted atrocities, her voice was heard precisely because it refused easy comfort. She reminded people that freedom is fragile, that evil can be ordinary, and that the responsibility of thought can never be abandoned. By the turn of the millennium, Hannah Arendt was no longer only the émigré philosopher who had scandalized her contemporaries. She was an enduring presence in global thought, a thinker whose concepts were invoked by dissidents, feminists, human rights lawyers, and artists alike. Her insistence that politics is the realm of action, that freedom is the capacity to begin anew, and that evil may be banal had become part of the vocabulary of the modern world. Her legacy was secure, but her meaning remained contested. And perhaps that was her greatest gift. She left us not with doctrines, but with questions. Not with answers, but with provocations. By the dawn of the 21st century, Hannah Arendt's words seemed to return with uncanny relevance. She had died in 1975, but her warnings about the fragility of freedom, the dangers of bureaucracy, and the banality of evil echoed into a new era shaped by terrorism, war, and surveillance. For a generation facing crises Arendt never lived to see, her thought became not merely historical, but prophetic. The turning point was September 11, 2001. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, the United States entered wars abroad and restructured its politics at home. Citizens wrestled with questions of fear, freedom, and security. In that atmosphere, Arendt's analyses of totalitarianism and her insistence on public freedom resurfaced with new urgency. Scholars, journalists, and ordinary readers turned back to the origins of totalitarianism to understand how fear can transform democracies, how exceptional measures can become normalized, and how the suspension of rights in the name of security might erode freedom itself. Her phrase, "the banality of evil," was invoked repeatedly in debates about terrorism. Could suicide bombers, or those who orchestrated attacks from hidden bases, be understood through her lens? Some argued yes, that they too reflected the ordinary mechanics of ideology and obedience. Others said no, that their fanaticism was of a different kind. Regardless, her language remained a touchstone, a reminder that evil need not always appear in monstrous form to wreak havoc. Meanwhile, her critique of bureaucracy resonated in new ways. As governments expanded surveillance, built security apparatuses, and managed wars through administration, Arendt's warning about the dangers of thoughtless obedience seems strikingly contemporary. Commentators pointed out that drone warfare, with its reliance on operators far from the battlefield, embodied precisely the detachment she had feared. Killing reduced to technical procedure, responsibility dissolved into systems. Her writings on truth also gained new prominence. In essays from the 1960s, Arendt had warned that politics is uniquely vulnerable to lies, not just ordinary lies, but systematic distortions that make reality itself uncertain. She distinguished between error, which can be corrected, and propaganda, which seeks to dissolve the very possibility of truth. In the age of fake news, misinformation, and manipulated media, these insights were rediscovered with alarm. Arendt's claim that freedom depends on a shared reality, and that the collapse of truth opens the door to tyranny, seemed written for the present. Academics revived her in conferences, books, and classrooms. Her concepts of plurality, natality, and action inspired new research in political theory, ethics, and cultural studies. Activists cited her in protests, from anti-war demonstrations to climate movements, where the call to act together in public resonated with her vision of politics. Feminist thinkers continued to explore her emphasis on beginnings, seeing in it a philosophy of creativity and resistance. Human rights lawyers used her analyses of responsibility to argue cases of genocide and war crimes. But it was not only scholars and activists who rediscovered her. Ordinary readers found her voice in bookstores and articles. Penguin Classics reissued her works. Documentaries introduced her to wider audiences. Plays and films dramatized her confrontation with Eichmann. Most famously, the 2012 film Hannah Arendt, which brought her back into popular consciousness. In that film, audiences saw her chain-smoking in Jerusalem, scribbling notes, refusing to bend under public scorn. She was portrayed not as a saint, but as a woman who dared to say what others would not. The film reignited debates. Some viewers condemned her again for insensitivity. Others hailed her courage. Once more, her words refused to lie dormant. She was a thinker who remained alive precisely because she never allowed comfort to replace truth. By the 2010s, her writings were cited in movements across the political spectrum. Some saw in her critique of totalitarianism a defense of liberal democracy against authoritarian populism. Others saw in her emphasis on councils and assemblies a radical call for grassroots democracy. Arendt herself would have resisted such appropriations. She distrusted ideology in all forms. But her voice, once marginal, had become central to the debates of the 21st century. In classrooms, her essays on violence became texts for students trying to understand terrorism, war, and protest. In civic discussions, her insistence on public spaces as the heart of freedom inspired activists who sought to reclaim streets, parks, and digital forums. In philosophy seminars, her unfinished work on judgment became a focal point for discussions of morality without absolutes. Perhaps the most striking revival came in her writings on lying and politics. In an age where truth itself seemed contested, Arendt's claim that facts are fragile, that they can be erased or manipulated, became a warning bell. Freedom, she had once written, is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 equals 4. The line, borrowed from Orwell but resonant in her work, captured the essence of her thought. Without truth, freedom collapses. By the early 21st century, Hannah Arendt had become a thinker not only of her century, but of ours. She was read in Eastern Europe, in South America, in Africa, and Asia. She was invoked in debates about authoritarianism, in struggles for democracy, in movements for justice. She had become a global voice, precisely because she had never written for popularity. She had written for reality. Her legacy in this era was not agreement, but relevance. People disagreed about her conclusions, debated her tone, questioned her accuracy, but no one could dismiss her. She remained, decades after her death, a thinker who forced confrontation with the hardest truths: that evil may be ordinary, that freedom is fragile, that truth can vanish, and that the responsibility to think is never optional. And so, as the 21st century unfolded, with wars, surveillance, misinformation, and new forms of power, Hannah Arendt's thought remained not a relic, but a guide, an unsettling reminder that the questions of her time are still the questions of ours. If Hannah Arendt's reputation in the 21st century has grown, it has also remained deeply contested. Few thinkers inspire such a mix of reverence and hostility, admiration and suspicion. Her legacy is not one of universal acclaim, but of constant argument, a fitting continuation of a life lived in controversy. One of the sharpest conflicts centers on her phrase, the banality of evil. Since its publication, it has been both celebrated as a profound insight and condemned as dangerously misleading. Critics argue that calling evil banal risks trivializing it, reducing genocide to paperwork. Survivors of the Holocaust, in particular, have sometimes felt that Arendt's formulation failed to capture the depth of their suffering. They insisted that Eichmann was not merely banal, but ideologically committed, a man who believed in extermination. Scholars such as Deborah Lipstadt and Bettina Stengnath later argued that Eichmann was far more than a mindless bureaucrat, that he was a convinced Nazi, loyal to the ideology of destruction. Defenders of Arendt counter that her phrase was never meant to deny Eichmann's guilt or minimize the Holocaust. She had, after all, supported his execution. What she meant, they argue, was that evil can be carried out without reflection, that its agents may not fit the image of sadistic monsters. In this reading, banality does not describe the crime, but the man, the ordinariness of his cliches, his refusal to think. The ongoing debate shows how provocative her language remains, a single phrase, endlessly interpreted, endlessly contested. Her comments on the Jewish councils remain another flashpoint. Arendt observed, in Eichmann in Jerusalem, that Jewish leaders under Nazi occupation sometimes cooperated with authorities in the hope of mitigating harm. She saw this as a tragic fact, but her decision to highlight it was met with outrage. Survivors accused her of blaming the victims, of reopening wounds that should have been left untouched. To this day, many readers see her remarks as unnecessarily cruel, while others defend them as part of her commitment to face reality without consolation. Beyond these Holocaust-related controversies, Arendt's political theories themselves invite conflict. Her elevation of action and public life as the highest forms of human freedom has been criticized as neglecting private suffering and economic realities. Marxist critics argue that she ignored class, labor, and material exploitation. Feminist critics note that while she resisted labels, her sharp division between public and private left little room for recognizing the politics of domestic life, gender roles, and care. Environmental thinkers have pointed out that her focus on human action overlooked the ecological limits within which politics unfolds. Even her style has been a source of contention. Admirers praise her clarity, her courage, her refusal to conform. Detractors accuse her of arrogance, of rhetorical sharpness that alienated as much as it illuminated. She could be dismissive, uncompromising, unwilling to soften her judgments. To some, this made her heroic, to others, intolerant. Yet her very divisiveness is part of what keeps her alive in debate. She never fit into neat categories. She was neither left nor right, neither liberal nor conservative, neither feminist nor anti-feminist. She insisted on independence of thought, which meant that every camp found something in her to admire and something to condemn. In the 21st century, her words are often invoked in political disputes, sometimes faithfully, sometimes carelessly. Protesters against authoritarianism cite her warnings about totalitarianism. Journalists covering bureaucratic scandals invoke the banality of evil. Populist critics of elites quote her critiques of bureaucracy. Yet these uses often flatten her complexity. Arendt herself would likely have been appalled at the way her phrases are thrown about without context. She warned against clichés, and in a twist of irony, her own language sometimes risks becoming one. Another source of conflict lies in her personal history. Her youthful affair with Martin Heidegger remains a thorn in her reputation. Heidegger, who joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and never fully renounced his involvement, has been criticized as one of philosophy's most compromised figures. Arendt defended him, maintaining their relationship long after the war. To some, this was hypocrisy. How could the great critic of totalitarianism remain loyal to a man who embraced Nazism? To others, it revealed her belief in the complexity of human beings, her refusal to reduce even Heidegger to a single political error. But the debate continues, complicating her legacy. Despite or because of these controversies, Arendt's influence has not waned. Her critics ensure that she is never canonized into harmlessness. Her defenders keep her voice in circulation, sharp and provocative. Her work inspires, unsettles, angers, and consoles. It refuses to sit quietly on a shelf. In the conflicts over her legacy, one truth emerges. Arendt remains alive as a thinker, not because she provided comfort, but because she forced confrontation. She believed that politics requires speech, judgment, and courage. Her own writings exemplify that belief. They continue to spark arguments not because they are flawed, though they may be, but because they are alive. And so her legacy is not unity but conflict. She belongs not to consensus but to debate. In this, she achieved what few philosophers do. She ensured that her thought remains a living part of the world, not a monument, but a conversation. If one thread of Hannah Arendt's thought has proven most prophetic for the 21st century, it is her warning about the fragility of truth. In essays written in the late 1960s and early 1970s, especially Truth and Politics and Lying in Politics, she diagnosed a danger that was then embryonic but now feels omnipresent, the systematic distortion of reality in public life. Arendt distinguished carefully between types of falsehood. Ordinary lies, she noted, had always existed in politics. Leaders had always bent facts to suit their aims. But she was more concerned with a deeper, more insidious phenomenon: the deliberate construction of false realities, the creation of fictions so pervasive that citizens could no longer distinguish fact from fabrication. This, she argued, was not simply lying. It was an assault on the very conditions of freedom. Freedom, for Arendt, required a shared world of facts. Citizens could disagree about values, judgments, and policies, but they needed to inhabit the same reality. When facts themselves were destroyed, when everything became opinion, politics collapsed into manipulation. The danger was not that people would believe a particular lie, but that they would stop believing in truth at all. In the early 21st century, her warnings reverberated with striking force. As populist leaders rose across the globe, many adopted strategies Arendt had described decades earlier, casting doubt on established facts, discrediting institutions of truth, flooding the public sphere with contradictory narratives. The result was not persuasion, but disorientation. Citizens, overwhelmed by noise, struggled to know what was real. The spread of digital media amplified this danger. Social networks became engines of misinformation, where rumors traveled faster than corrections. Conspiracy theories flourished, eroding trust in elections, science, and journalism. Commentators quoted her with increasing frequency, noting her claim that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. Written in response to the Pentagon Papers, also returned to relevance. There she described how governments, in pursuing illusions, create false realities not only for their citizens but for themselves. The lies of leaders, she warned, are dangerous not just because they deceive the public, but because rulers come to inhabit their own fabrications. In wars fought on illusions, in policies built on denial, she saw the seeds of catastrophe. In the 21st century, as governments justified conflicts with questionable evidence, her words echoed with eerie clarity. Arendt's thought also shaped debates about journalism. In an era where journalists are attacked as enemies of the people, her defense of factual truth became a rallying point. She had insisted that facts are stubborn, that they cannot be replaced by opinion without eroding the foundation of freedom. For her, the role of the press was not to persuade but to protect reality, to ensure that citizens shared a common ground from which debate could proceed. But her insights were not merely warnings. They also contained hope. By emphasizing the importance of plurality, she suggested that truth emerges not from authoritarian certainty, but from the clash of perspectives. For Arendt, politics at its best was not the imposition of one truth, but the encounter of many voices within a shared reality. In this vision, democracy is sustained not by unanimity, but by the integrity of facts combined with the freedom of judgment. Her influence on these debates has grown steadily. Scholars cite her to analyze authoritarian movements in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Journalists invoke her when describing disinformation campaigns. Activists turn to her when defending truth against propaganda. Her language, once academic, has become part of the public struggle for democracy. Yet here, too, her legacy is contested. Critics argue that her emphasis on truth risks idealizing objectivity, neglecting the ways power shapes knowledge. Postmodern thinkers suggest that facts are always entangled in interpretation, that her call for factual truth may underestimate complexity. Others insist that her framework remains indispensable, that without some commitment to shared reality, politics disintegrates altogether. The debates themselves show her enduring relevance. In an era where citizens question elections, where science is politicized, where leaders openly lie without consequence, Arendt's voice is not only remembered, but urgently needed. She reminds us that truth is not guaranteed, that it must be defended as fiercely as freedom itself. By the 2020s, her words were quoted in newspapers, parliaments, protests, and classrooms. Her image appeared on posters at marches defending democracy. She was invoked in debates about whistleblowers, journalists, and digital misinformation. Her insistence that thinking and judging are responsibilities, not luxuries, became a call to action. The irony, of course, is that Arendt herself distrusted slogans. She would have bristled at being reduced to a symbol, at seeing her name used in ways detached from her careful arguments. Yet her warnings about truth, lies, and propaganda had entered the bloodstream of democracy. They had become part of the collective attempt to understand a world where reality itself is contested. And so, half a century after her death, Hannah Arendt stood at the center of one of the greatest challenges of our age, the struggle to preserve truth in politics. Hannah Arendt's writings on violence have long unsettled readers, and in the 21st century they have only grown more provocative. Her slim 1970 essay on violence, written in response to student uprisings and revolutionary fervor, challenged assumptions that violence is simply another form of power. For Arendt, violence was not synonymous with power, but its opposite, a tool that destroys rather than creates, a means that corrodes the very freedom it claims to serve. This distinction, which seemed abstract when first published, gained new urgency in an era marked by waves of protest, insurgency, and authoritarian backlash. Movements from the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, from Hong Kong to Black Lives Matter, grappled with questions Arendt had posed decades earlier. What is the relationship between violence and freedom? Can force ever serve the cause of justice, or does it inevitably betray it? Arendt's answer was stark. Power, she argued, arises when people act together, when they speak and deliberate in public, when they form institutions that sustain freedom. Violence, by contrast, may destroy enemies or topple regimes, but it cannot build legitimacy. Power and violence are opposites, she wrote, where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. In her view, revolutions that rely on violence risk undermining the very politics they hope to create. Her critics, then and now, have called this naive. They argue that, without violence, oppressive regimes rarely yield. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century all involved bloodshed. Arendt did not deny this, but she insisted that the true achievements of revolutions lay not in their violence, but in the institutions they created afterward. Violence, she maintained, could clear the ground, but it could not plant the seeds of freedom. This claim has divided activists in the 21st century. Nonviolent movements, inspired by figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., often cite Arendt as a defender of their approach. They point to her insistence that power is sustained by collective action, not coercion. They see in her work an affirmation that protest, speech, and assembly are more powerful than weapons. But others see her as blind to realities of oppression. In regions where regimes unleash brutal violence against their own people, critics argue, Arendt's caution seems detached from lived experience. For them, her suspicion of revolutionary violence risks excusing passivity, underestimating the urgency of force when survival itself is at stake. Her influence is not limited to activists. Governments and policymakers, too, engage with her thought, often in unexpected ways. Military strategists have cited her distinction between power and violence to argue that force alone cannot secure legitimacy in occupied territories. Scholars of insurgency have used her analysis to explain why revolutions succeed or fail. Her insistence that violence cannot substitute for politics has become a touchstone in debates about counterterrorism, nation-building, and state power. The conflicts of the 21st century, terrorist attacks, authoritarian crackdowns, populist uprisings have kept her insights painfully relevant. In the wake of violent protests, commentators invoke her warnings. After authoritarian regimes crush dissent, her writings are reread as diagnoses of the fragility of public spaces. Her analysis circulates not as abstract theory, but as a living guide to the dilemmas of our age. Yet, as always, her legacy is contested. Radicals accuse her of underestimating the cleansing force of violence. Conservatives accuse her of overvaluing spontaneous assemblies. Academics debate whether her framework can account for structural oppression. Activists argue about whether her vision of politics is too idealistic. But in all these debates, her voice is present not as an answer, but as a challenge. Her concept of natality, the idea that every birth represents the possibility of a new beginning, continues to inspire those who believe in change without violence. For Arendt, every act of speech, every gesture of courage in public, is a form of beginning. In this way, she reminds us that politics is not only about institutions or revolutions, but about the capacity of human beings to appear before each other, to start anew. The global protests of the last 2 decades illustrate the resonance of her vision. From Cairo's Tahrir Square to New York's Zuccotti Park, from Gezi Park in Istanbul to the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong, citizens have gathered in public spaces to act together. In these assemblies, Arendt's description of politics as action and plurality seems to come alive. Yet the violent responses of regimes also highlight her warning: when force replaces dialogue, politics itself collapses. Hannah Arendt's writings on violence do not settle the debates of our time. They sharpen them. They remind us that the line between power and force is fragile, that freedom depends on institutions of action, not coercion, and that revolutions succeed only when they sustain plurality. In the 21st century, as in her own, these insights remain both urgent and unsettling. She does not tell us what to do, she tells us what is at stake. When Hannah Arendt died in 1975, she left behind fragments of her most ambitious project, The Life of the Mind. The volumes on thinking and willing had been drafted and later published, but the third volume, on judging, remained unwritten. For her students and interpreters, this absence became one of the most tantalizing mysteries of her legacy. What would she have said about judgment, the faculty most intimately tied to politics, morality, and responsibility? Arendt herself gave clues. In lectures and notes, she often turned to Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment, a work she considered central to understanding how humans evaluate right and wrong without absolute rules. Unlike Kant's earlier writings on morality, which sought universal laws, the Critique of Judgment explored a different path: judgment as the capacity to think from the standpoint of others, to broaden one's perspective, to deliberate in the absence of certainty. This notion fascinated Arendt. She saw in it the possibility of grounding moral responsibility, not in rigid commandments, but in the exercise of imagination and plurality. To judge, she believed, was not to apply rules mechanically, but to see from another's perspective, to weigh reality in common. It was, in essence, the faculty that Eichmann lacked: the ability to think beyond cliches, to imagine the consequences of his actions, to confront the silent dialogue with himself. In the decades after her death, scholars seized upon this unfinished work. Some argued that her theory of judgment was the key to understanding her entire philosophy. Without it, her analysis of the banality of evil remained incomplete. Others suggested that she deliberately left it unwritten, that judgment, by its nature, resists systematization. Nevertheless, her fragments have inspired rich debates in philosophy, law, and ethics. In human rights discourse, Arendt's notion of judgment has been invoked to explain how tribunals might confront atrocities without relying solely on abstract law. Judges at international courts have cited her when grappling with questions of responsibility, intent, and complicity. Her insistence on enlarged mentality, the effort to see through the eyes of others, has become a moral guideline for justice in global contexts. In political theory, her reflections on judgment have been used to argue for a more participatory democracy. If judgment depends on plurality, then citizens must engage with diverse perspectives, must deliberate across differences. This vision contrasts with technocratic governance, which treats politics as administration. For Arendt, politics requires judgment precisely because it is unpredictable, because no rulebook can anticipate the novelty of human action. Ethically, her fragments resonate in debates about complicity and responsibility. In the aftermath of genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia, scholars turn to Arendt to ask, how should ordinary citizens who participate in atrocities be judged? Is obedience an excuse? Is ignorance? Arendt's answer, implied though not complete, was that each individual bears responsibility to think, to judge, to resist thoughtlessness. Evil, she suggested, thrives not only on ideology, but on the abdication of judgment. Her unfinished philosophy also influences cultural criticism. Artists, writers, and filmmakers have drawn on her vision of judgment as an imaginative act, a form of storytelling that allows one to enter another's world. For them, Arendt provides a framework where art becomes political, not by propaganda, but by expanding our capacity to judge. Yet the incompleteness of her work has also been a source of frustration. Some accuse her of evading the hardest questions. If judgment cannot be codified, how can it be practiced? How do we ensure consistency? How do we avoid relativism? Without clear answers, critics argue, her philosophy risks leaving individuals adrift. Others see this openness as her strength. Judgment, by nature, cannot be reduced to formulas. It requires the courage of individuals, the willingness to risk decisions without certainty. In the 21st century, her fragments have been tested in practice. Courts dealing with war crimes, activists confronting injustice, and citizens navigating polarized politics all face the challenge of judgment. Arendt's vision does not provide easy solutions, but it offers a compass. Think from the standpoint of others, resist cliches, confront reality directly. The irony is that her most unfinished work may be her most relevant. In an age of fractured democracies, competing truths, and moral ambiguity, the need for judgment, imaginative, plural, responsible, is greater than ever. Arendt did not finish the book. Instead, she left it to us. Hannah Arendt's intellectual life is often discussed without sufficient attention to the personal relationships that shaped it. None more controversial than her enduring connection with Martin Heidegger. Their relationship began in 1924 when Arendt was just 18 as a student in Marburg, captivated by his lectures on philosophy and being. Heidegger, married with children, began an affair with her, a liaison that would define both their lives in intimate and troubling ways. This early connection was formative for Arendt. Heidegger's intensity, his focus on authenticity, and his call to confront existence itself left a lasting imprint on her thought. She credited him with awakening her to philosophy as a lived endeavor, one inseparable from the dilemmas of action and responsibility. Yet Heidegger's later embrace of Nazism in 1933 cast a long shadow. The man who had first inspired her became, decades later, a figure whose moral choices were indefensible. For Arendt, the tension was profound. She could neither forget the lessons Heidegger had imparted, nor absolve him of his political failings. This duality mirrors her broader approach to moral and political questions. She resisted simple binaries. One could admire insight without endorsing the thinker's actions. One could be intellectually indebted while morally critical. To Arendt, acknowledging this complexity was itself a form of judgment. After World War II, Arendt's engagement with Heidegger became a source of scandal. Scholars and friends could not reconcile her continued correspondence with him alongside her critique of totalitarianism. To some, it appeared that she had excused or minimized his Nazi affiliation. Critics asked, how could the author of The Origins of Totalitarianism remain loyal to someone complicit in one of history's great atrocities? The question haunted public perception of her work for decades. Arendt's defense was neither simplistic nor apologetic. She acknowledged Heidegger's moral failure but distinguished between the philosophical and the political. She argued that his thought retained value even as his actions were condemnable. In letters and essays, she emphasized the possibility of separating ideas from conduct without endorsing immorality. This stance, however, proved controversial. Many believed that intellectual admiration implied complicity or forgiveness too easily granted. The controversy touches on themes central to her philosophy. Arendt's focus on thinking as a moral activity, on judgment as an engagement with plural perspectives, and on freedom as public action informs her approach to Heidegger. She believed that understanding another human being does not require condoning their choices, but it does demand confronting complexity. Human beings are not reducible to their worst acts, and even those we condemn can retain insight worthy of study. This philosophy of nuanced evaluation, however, comes at a cost. Arendt's public reputation suffered. Gershom Scholem, her friend and colleague, criticized her judgment. Jewish intellectuals and contemporaries were scandalized. Yet Arendt maintained that intellectual honesty required engagement, not retreat. She refused to simplify her relationships for the comfort of others, even if it meant alienation. In a broader sense, her relationship with Heidegger serves as a lens for her lifelong concern with human responsibility. It exemplifies the challenge of judgment in morally complex situations. To recognize greatness without excusing wrongdoing. To separate ideas from actions without losing ethical clarity. It illuminates the paradox she identified in politics and history itself, that individuals, institutions, and societies are often entangled in contradictions that resist easy resolution. The enduring fascination with this relationship also reflects a tension in Arendt's thought, the collision between loyalty and conscience. Heidegger was both a mentor and a moral failure. Arendt remained loyal to their intellectual bond while never softening her condemnation of his politics. She embodied, in life, the very balance she demanded of judgment: thoughtful, uncompromising, capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously. In contemporary scholarship, debates over Arendt and Heidegger continue. Some interpret her engagement as a cautionary tale about separating philosophy from morality. Others see it as evidence of the courage to engage intellectually, even with morally compromised figures. In either case, the relationship underscores the depth of Arendt's thinking. She demanded reflection, dialogue, and courage, not conformity or ease. Ultimately, her connection to Heidegger illustrates the human dimension of her philosophy. It is a reminder that thought is never abstract, that relationships shape understanding, and that judgment requires both ethical rigor and personal engagement. She lived the dilemmas she analyzed, negotiating loyalty, betrayal, admiration, and moral clarity in ways that remain instructive today. The controversy surrounding Heidegger, combined with her broader work on totalitarianism, violence, and responsibility, ensures that Arendt's legacy remains complex. She is neither idealized nor dismissed. She challenges readers to grapple with the contradictions inherent in human life. In this, her life and work converge, offering a lesson about the courage to think, even when truth is uncomfortable, even when love and judgment collide. Hannah Arendt's death in 1975 marked the end of a singular life, but it was only the beginning of her influence. In the decades following her passing, her writings gained renewed significance, appearing not only in academic discourse but also in global political debates, legal scholarship, journalism, and the arts. Arendt's legacy is unusual. She is both a historical witness and a philosopher whose ideas continue to provoke argument, interpretation, and inspiration. Her intellectual descendants span multiple fields. In political science, scholars invoke her work on totalitarianism, action, and freedom to analyze contemporary regimes. Students of authoritarianism, populism, and bureaucratic governance find in her writings a framework for understanding how systems manipulate obedience, erode public spaces, and reshape morality. Her insistence that evil can manifest through ordinary, unthinking individuals remains central to discussions of state violence and institutional complicity. Philosophers continue to engage with her explorations of thinking, willing, and judging. The Life of the Mind, although unfinished, inspires reflection on moral responsibility in conditions of uncertainty. Her engagement with Kant and Socrates provides a model for thinking as both practical and ethical. In contemporary debates about moral ambiguity, artificial intelligence, or bioethics, Arendt's emphasis on judgment as a capacity to imagine the perspective of others remains compelling. Arendt's influence is particularly visible in the realm of human rights. Her articulation of the right to have rights has been cited in analyses of refugee crises, statelessness, and the protections afforded to displaced populations. Scholars and activists note that her observation, that human rights are meaningless without political communities to uphold them, is more relevant than ever in an era of mass migration, asylum challenges, and shrinking democratic institutions. Her thought provides not only diagnosis, but also moral orientation. Freedom and dignity depend on active political engagement, not merely on legal instruments. In law, Arendt's ideas have shaped discussions of accountability and complicity. International tribunals and human rights organizations draw on her work to frame questions about responsibility during genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Her insights illuminate the limits of legal structures when individuals refuse to think critically or act responsibly. Her work offers a vocabulary for understanding how ordinary participants become perpetrators and how judgment must extend beyond mere adherence to law. The arts and literature also reflect her enduring influence. Plays, films, and novels often invoke the Eichmann trial or her reflections on totalitarianism to explore human behavior, moral courage, and complicity. Documentaries dramatizing her life have brought her philosophy to wider audiences, demonstrating that her influence is not confined to academia, but permeates public culture. Even in digital media, her concepts, particularly the banality of evil, appear in debates on corporate malfeasance, political bureaucracy, and social conformity. Her life story, refugee, stateless citizen, scholar, and public intellectual, adds resonance to her work. Arendt's personal experience informs her insistence on independence, moral responsibility, and the urgency of thought. Readers and students see in her life an embodiment of the principles she wrote about: resilience, courage, refusal to conform, and commitment to truth even under pressure. In this way, her biography and philosophy are inseparable. Despite widespread admiration, her legacy remains contested. Critics continue to challenge her portrayal of Eichmann, her treatment of Jewish councils, and her emphasis on public action over social and economic realities. Some argue that her philosophy underestimates material inequality or overlooks systemic oppression. Others find her insistence on personal judgment idealistic. Yet the persistence of these debates attests to her vitality as a thinker. Her work provokes dialogue rather than closure, reflection rather than complacency. Her writings have also inspired new generations of thinkers across disciplines. Political theorists, ethicists, sociologists, and human rights scholars find in her approach a model of intellectual rigor combined with moral seriousness. Philosophers of education draw on her insistence that critical thought, dialogue, and judgment must be cultivated, not imposed. Activists reference her work to argue for civic engagement, public spaces, and the defense of pluralism against authoritarian impulses. Moreover, Arendt's influence extends globally. Universities across Europe, the Americas, and Asia teach her work. Translation projects ensure her ideas reach non-English speaking audiences. International conferences and research networks continue to explore her concepts, from totalitarianism to freedom, violence to judgment. Her writings are not static, they evolve as new contexts reveal their relevance. Arendt's enduring legacy can also be seen in the digital age. In a world of fragmented media, social networks, and contested realities, her warnings about truth, propaganda, and the responsibility of thinking are particularly prescient. Her insistence that freedom relies on shared reality, plurality, and moral responsibility resonates in discussions about democracy, misinformation, and civic engagement. She provides both caution and guidance. Democracy cannot endure without active, critical citizens. Ultimately, Arendt's influence lies in her ability to bridge historical experience with philosophical insight. She observed the horrors of the 20th century and sought not only to explain them, but to illuminate principles for responsible action in human life. Her work remains alive because it demands engagement. It asks readers to think, to judge, and to act, echoing the very conditions she described as essential to human dignity. Far from remaining a figure confined to mid-20th century debates, Arendt has become the subject of rigorous, global academic inquiry. Universities, research institutes, and archives now preserve and interpret her writings, correspondences, and unpublished materials, ensuring that her thought remains accessible, scrutinized, and relevant. Several Arendt-focused centers have been established to facilitate study and engagement with her legacy. The Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, founded in 1995, stands at the forefront of this effort. It offers lectures, conferences, publications, and fellowships dedicated to exploring her work and its application to contemporary politics, ethics, and philosophy. The center emphasizes public scholarship, ensuring that Arendt's insights reach beyond academia to inform public debate and civic engagement. In Europe, institutions like the Hannah Arendt Institute for Research on Totalitarianism in Dresden, Germany, focus on her contributions to political theory and her analyses of totalitarian regimes. Scholars there examine the historical context of her work, its methodological innovations, and its applicability to understanding modern authoritarian movements. These research centers provide critical editions, translations, and interpretive frameworks, situating Arendt's work in dialogue with contemporary scholarship. Her personal papers, letters, and manuscripts, housed in archives such as the Library of Congress and the Leo Baeck Institute, have opened new avenues for research. Scholars analyze her correspondences with Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, Mary McCarthy, and others to better understand the personal dimensions of her thought. The letters reveal her intellectual struggles, moral reflections, and the emotional context in which she developed her theories, offering invaluable insight into her methodology and perspective. Annual conferences and symposia dedicated to Arendt have proliferated. These gatherings draw historians, political theorists, philosophers, sociologists, and activists, reflecting the interdisciplinary nature of her legacy. Themes often explore totalitarianism, evil, judgment, action, plurality, and the relevance of her thought to contemporary crises. Papers presented at these conferences examine global issues, refugee crises, populism, mass surveillance, civic engagement, through the lens of Arendtian theory. The proliferation of scholarly publications has also contributed to her revival. Academic journals, edited volumes, and monographs continue to debate, reinterpret, and expand on her ideas. Editors meticulously examine her unfinished works, particularly the third volume of The Life of the Mind, exploring how her reflections on judgment can inform modern ethics, law, and politics. Scholars investigate intersections with feminist theory, critical theory, phenomenology, and moral philosophy, demonstrating the adaptability of her thought across disciplines. Digital humanities projects have further expanded access to Arendt's work. Online databases provide searchable archives of her essays, letters, and manuscripts. Digitized editions of her books allow global audiences to engage with her thought, often with annotations, commentary, and contextual materials. Social media and educational platforms introduce her writings to new generations, ensuring her ideas influence not only scholars but students, activists, and civic leaders. The scholarly revival also emphasizes the ongoing relevance of Arendt's historical and moral insights. Researchers explore contemporary totalitarian tendencies, the erosion of public truth, bureaucratic abuses, and the fragility of democratic institutions through her frameworks. She is increasingly cited in analyses of authoritarianism, populism, the ethics of artificial intelligence, and the politics of migration, demonstrating the enduring utility of her theories. Furthermore, interdisciplinary programs integrate Arendt into broader debates about ethics, governance, and social responsibility. Political science courses examine her theories of action, power, and violence. Philosophy departments explore her unfinished work on judgment. Law schools apply her insights on responsibility, complicity, and moral evaluation in the study of international justice. Even literature and media studies engage with her concepts, using her framework to analyze narrative, representation, and the depiction of human responsibility. The revival is not merely academic. Arendt's ideas continue to influence civic initiatives, nonprofit organizations, and public discourse. Her warnings about the banality of evil, the fragility of rights, and the necessity of action inform advocacy for human rights, democracy, and ethical governance. Workshops and public programs based on her thought teach citizens to engage in critical dialogue, to resist thoughtlessness, and to exercise judgment in public life. This ongoing attention demonstrates the durability of Arendt's insights. She is not a philosopher confined to the past, but a thinker whose work continues to illuminate contemporary crises. Through research centers, conferences, archives, publications, and digital projects, her thought has become a living, evolving presence in global intellectual life, shaping scholarship, pedagogy, and activism alike. In the 21st century, Hannah Arendt is thus not only remembered but actively engaged. Her work is debated, applied, and expanded, ensuring that her voice, her warnings, and her moral and political vision continue to challenge, instruct, and inspire. Her revival reflects a remarkable phenomenon, a thinker whose relevance grows with the challenges of the modern world, whose insistence on thought, judgment, and action remains as urgent today as it was in her lifetime. Hannah Arendt's thought has long transcended academic boundaries, finding particular relevance in the sphere of education and civic engagement. In the 21st century, educators and civic programs increasingly invoke her theories to teach critical thinking, moral responsibility, and active participation in democratic life. Her insistence that freedom is exercised in the public sphere, that judgment is cultivated through reflection and dialogue, provides a blueprint for contemporary pedagogical approaches. In primary and secondary education, some schools have integrated Arendt's concepts into curricula focused on citizenship and ethics. Programs inspired by her work emphasize the importance of discussion, debate, and deliberation. Students are encouraged to consider multiple perspectives, to evaluate arguments critically, and to confront moral dilemmas. By introducing the concepts of plurality, action, and responsibility, educators aim to cultivate not only knowledge, but judgment, the ability to make thoughtful decisions in complex social contexts. Universities around the world have developed courses explicitly dedicated to Arendt's philosophy. These courses often pair historical study with ethical reflection, examining totalitarianism alongside contemporary political crises. Students analyze the origins of totalitarianism to understand historical patterns of oppression, then consider how her concepts of action and judgment apply to current issues such as climate change, migration, and digital surveillance. The goal is not simply comprehension, but active engagement. Students are tasked with envisioning solutions and critically assessing their implications. Civic engagement programs have also drawn on Arendt's insights. Nonprofit organizations and public foundations incorporate her ideas to foster informed participation in democratic life. Workshops teach citizens to recognize thoughtlessness, to interrogate bureaucratic processes, and to engage in public action rather than passive observation. Her distinction between power and violence informs training programs for activists, emphasizing that true influence arises not from coercion, but from organized, participatory action. Digital initiatives have expanded Arendt's reach further. Online courses, interactive platforms, and discussion forums employ her philosophy to cultivate critical thinking in global contexts. Students, activists, and citizens can explore her writings collaboratively, using technology to simulate public discourse. These programs stress her core principles: freedom depends on participation, plural perspectives are essential, and judgment requires reflection rather than adherence to authority or ideology. Her influence is particularly visible in programs addressing youth engagement in governance and social responsibility. Educational initiatives inspired by Arendt encourage young people to deliberate on social and political issues, to practice decision-making in group settings, and to experience firsthand the responsibilities of public action. These programs emphasize moral courage, highlighting that ethical decisions often require standing against majority opinion or institutional pressure. A lesson central to Arendt's analysis of the banality of evil. Higher education institutions have also incorporated her thought into leadership and policy programs. Courses for emerging leaders in government, civil society, and international organizations use Arendt's writings to examine the limits of authority, the importance of plurality, and the role of moral judgment. Participants engage with case studies on bureaucracy, propaganda, and institutional responsibility, applying her insights to modern governance challenges. The arts and humanities also contribute to educational engagement with Arendt. Theater productions, literary analysis, and multimedia projects allow students to explore moral and political dilemmas dramatized in her writings. These methods translate abstract concepts into experiential learning, enabling participants to grasp the stakes of thoughtlessness, conformity, and the erosion of public life. Furthermore, global education programs emphasize Arendt's insights on the refugee experience and statelessness. Students and educators explore her analysis of the right to have rights, connecting historical case studies with contemporary challenges in migration and human rights. These programs encourage learners to recognize both the legal and ethical dimensions of belonging, highlighting the ongoing relevance of her philosophy in addressing crises of displacement worldwide. Her educational influence is not only theoretical but practical. By emphasizing deliberation, reflection, and civic action, Arendt-inspired programs aim to cultivate active citizens capable of navigating complex social and political environments. These programs embody her vision. Democracy is not a set of institutions alone, but a continuous process requiring thoughtful engagement, judgment, and courage. The impact of these initiatives is evident. Students report enhanced ability to consider multiple perspectives, to analyze information critically, and to engage in dialogue across differences. Civic engagement programs inspired by her philosophy often result in increased participation, stronger collaboration, and heightened awareness of ethical responsibility. Arendt's emphasis on plurality and public action ensures that these educational efforts focus not merely on knowledge acquisition, but on the formation of responsible, reflective citizens. In an era marked by polarization, misinformation, and threats to democratic norms, the educational applications of Arendt's thought are increasingly vital. Her philosophy provides a framework for understanding the importance of reflection, the necessity of judgment, and the moral imperative to act responsibly within public life. By cultivating critical thought and civic engagement, Arendt's ideas continue to shape generations capable of confronting complex moral and political challenges. Through classrooms, civic workshops, digital platforms, and global initiatives, her influence on education demonstrates the enduring power of her philosophy. Arendt's insistence that thinking and judgment are essential to human dignity and freedom continues to inspire practices that nurture reflection, moral courage, and active participation. A living legacy that sustains democracy in an age of uncertainty. Hannah Arendt's writings on totalitarianism, the right to have rights, and the nature of moral responsibility continue to resonate profoundly in debates about human rights and global justice. Across the globe, scholars, policymakers, and activists draw on her insights to understand both historical atrocities and contemporary crises. Her philosophy offers tools for assessing the fragility of legal protections, the dangers of bureaucratic complicity, and the ethical obligations of individuals in the face of injustice. The concept of the right to have rights, first articulated in The Origins of Totalitarianism, has become a foundational idea in discussions about stateless populations, refugees, and displaced persons. Arendt argued that rights are meaningless without a political community capable of enforcing them. This perspective has informed international legal debates about citizenship, asylum, and protection. Organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and human rights NGOs reference her work to stress the importance of legal recognition as a precondition for meaningful human rights. Her analysis of statelessness and displacement is particularly relevant in the 21st century. Conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and sub-Saharan Africa have created millions of refugees, many of whom lack legal recognition or protection. Arendt's work illuminates the moral and practical challenges inherent in these situations, highlighting that political and social belonging are inseparable from basic human rights. Activists and scholars emphasize her call for moral responsibility in ensuring that no human being exists outside the protection of law. In discussions of global justice, Arendt's emphasis on judgment and responsibility has provided ethical guidance. International tribunals, such as the International Criminal Court, confront questions reminiscent of her observations on Eichmann. How should individuals be held accountable for participation in atrocities? Can following orders be an excuse? Her insistence that thoughtlessness enables complicity informs contemporary legal frameworks and ethical deliberations, shaping debates about accountability in cases of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Arendt's thought also shapes responses to modern authoritarianism. Scholars studying democratic erosion invoke her work on totalitarianism to identify early warning signs, the manipulation of truth, the erosion of plural public spaces, and the bureaucratic normalization of violence. Her emphasis on the need for active, plural participation in governance offers a blueprint for resisting authoritarian tendencies. Civic organizations and policy advisors reference her work when designing programs that encourage citizen engagement, transparency, and accountability. Her ideas have influenced human rights education globally. Curricula based on Arendt's work focus on ethical responsibility, the dangers of conformity, and the importance of moral reflection. Students learn to recognize both structural oppression and individual complicity. They study historical cases alongside contemporary challenges, understanding that the lessons of the Holocaust, totalitarian regimes, and stateless populations are not confined to the past but must inform present-day decisions. Arendt's warnings about propaganda and the erosion of truth remain particularly pertinent. The spread of misinformation, state-controlled media, and ideological manipulation is often compared to her analyses of totalitarian regimes. Activists and scholars alike draw on her writings to emphasize the importance of critical media literacy, the defense of factual truth, and the cultivation of independent judgment as foundations for effective human rights advocacy. Her work also resonates in the context of global governance. International organizations, NGOs, and transnational networks confront challenges that mirror the bureaucratic and moral dilemmas Arendt described. Questions about the ethical distribution of aid, intervention in conflict zones, and the balance between sovereignty and human rights invoke her reflections on moral responsibility, plurality, and the need for judgment beyond rigid legalism. Moreover, Arendt's insistence that freedom and responsibility are inseparable informs contemporary activism. Movements for climate justice, racial equity, gender equality, and democratic governance often cite her insights on action and plurality. Citizens and leaders alike are reminded that freedom is realized through participation and judgment, not through passivity or compliance. Her work provides both moral grounding and practical guidance for those confronting systemic injustice. Arendt's influence extends beyond theory into policy. Legal scholars use her analyses to critique systems of bureaucratic oppression, to assess the efficacy of international law, and to guide frameworks for accountability in transitional justice. Political theorists examine the interaction between citizens and institutions, drawing on her ideas to design participatory mechanisms that prevent concentration of power. In all cases, her work emphasizes the human capacity for responsibility, reminding practitioners that legal systems alone cannot prevent atrocities without active, reflective citizens. Her legacy in these debates underscores a central theme. Arendt provides a language for understanding both human vulnerability and the possibilities of ethical action. By connecting historical analysis with moral philosophy, she equips scholars, policymakers, and activists to address contemporary crises with both rigor and conscience. Her insights into evil, responsibility, and political action continue to inform responses to authoritarianism, statelessness, and violations of human rights worldwide. Ultimately, Hannah Arendt's work remains indispensable for understanding the moral and political dimensions of contemporary global challenges. Her vision of judgment, responsibility, and action continues to guide efforts to preserve freedom, defend human dignity, and confront the structures and individuals that threaten both. In a world marked by displacement, misinformation, and authoritarian pressures, Arendt's thought offers a beacon, illuminating the path toward ethical, engaged citizenship and resilient democratic governance. Hannah Arendt's life and work form one of the most compelling legacies in modern intellectual history. She lived through some of the darkest periods of the 20th century, witnessing the collapse of democratic institutions, the rise of totalitarian regimes, the deportations and mass murders of the Holocaust, and the displacements of exile. Yet she did not retreat into despair or abstraction. Instead, she dedicated herself to observing, analyzing, and thinking critically about the human condition. Her enduring legacy emerges from both her experiences and her uncompromising engagement with the moral, political, and philosophical questions they provoked. Arendt's contributions span several interrelated fields. In political theory, she provided a framework for understanding totalitarianism not merely as tyranny, but as a phenomenon that destroys the capacity for judgment and plurality. She demonstrated that oppression relies not only on ideology, but also on the unthinking compliance of ordinary individuals, revealing the human dimensions of systemic evil. Her phrase, the banality of evil, crystallized this insight, emphasizing that the most dangerous perpetrators of atrocities may not be fanatics or monsters, but bureaucrats who abandon the responsibility to think critically. In philosophy, Arendt grappled with the complexities of thought, willing, and judgment. Through the life of the mind, she explored the moral and existential dimensions of human consciousness. Although the volume on judgment remained unfinished, her reflections on thinking as a dialogical, reflective practice continue to guide ethical and philosophical debates. She showed that morality is inseparable from active thought, that reflection is a moral obligation, and that ethical living requires engagement with the world rather than retreat from it. Arendt's reflections on freedom, action, and public life remain central to contemporary debates about democracy. Her insistence that freedom exists in spaces of collective action, dialogue, and deliberation provides a counterpoint to bureaucratic administration, populist demagoguery, and technocratic governance. She emphasized the importance of plurality, highlighting that human beings achieve dignity and purpose, not in isolation, but in the shared world of action and responsibility. Her attention to the stateless, the displaced, and the vulnerable gave her work an ethical urgency rarely matched in political theory. Arendt's concept of the right to have rights underscores the fragility of human protections and the necessity of political communities to sustain them. In an era of mass migration, refugee crises, and shrinking civil liberties, this insight remains profoundly relevant. Her work challenges societies to recognize the humanity of all individuals, not only those who are citizens, enfranchised, or powerful. Arendt's life also exemplifies her philosophy. She endured exile, imprisonment, and social ostracism, yet she remained intellectually independent, morally uncompromising, and fearless in confronting uncomfortable truths. Her experiences of displacement and statelessness informed her understanding of human vulnerability, while her intellectual rigor ensured that her reflections were neither sentimental nor abstract. She embodied the principles she articulated: action, judgment, responsibility, and courage. Her influence continues to extend across disciplines and continents. Political scientists, historians, philosophers, human rights scholars, legal theorists, and educators draw on her work to analyze oppression, cultivate critical thinking, and shape civic engagement. Activists invoke her concepts when challenging authoritarianism, defending pluralism, and promoting social justice. Educators integrate her ideas into curricula designed to foster judgment, reflection, and ethical responsibility among students. Even in popular culture, her insights resonate through documentaries, films, literature, and public debate, demonstrating the enduring accessibility and applicability of her thought. Arendt's life also challenges the simplistic separation of personal morality from intellectual rigor. Her friendship with Karl Jaspers, her complex relationship with Heidegger, and her loyalty to principles rather than popularity illustrate her commitment to independent thought. She insisted that moral clarity and philosophical insight require confrontation with ambiguity, discomfort, and even social criticism. Her courage in defending her ideas, even in the face of widespread condemnation, remains a model for scholars, thinkers, and citizens alike. Finally, her relevance persists because she leaves questions open rather than providing easy answers. She does not offer utopias or solutions, but she illuminates the conditions under which freedom, responsibility, and human dignity can flourish. She reminds us that the fight against evil, thoughtlessness, and oppression is ongoing, that civic engagement is never complete, and that the exercise of judgment is both a personal and collective responsibility. Hannah Arendt's enduring legacy lies in her insistence on the ethical and political significance of thinking, speaking, and acting. She teaches that freedom is realized through engagement, that evil flourishes in the absence of reflection, and that human beings must continually exercise judgment to sustain justice and dignity. Across generations, her work continues to inspire reflection, debate, and action, offering both a moral compass and a challenge to live responsibly in a world that remains, as always, complex, perilous, and profoundly human. Her voice continues to speak to us, not as a comforting guide, but as a persistent summons to think, to judge, and to act. In the 21st century, as in her own, the world demands no less. Hannah Arendt remains, in every sense, a thinker for our time, a philosopher of courage, clarity, and conscience.